Hello to all of the real progressives out there. I want to thank you so much for tuning in today. We have a fantastic show ready for you. Lots of important topics to go over. I do want to start with a few quick plugs. You can go to realprogressives.org if you want to learn more about us or support our organization. You can follow us at Real Progress US and at RP_in_action. I'm at Luke Parcher Show. If you want to follow me as well, make sure that you're keeping up to date with all of our fantastic work. And in the spirit of mentioning our fantastic work, I want to make sure nobody misses tonight's episode of the new Untouchables. It drops at 8 p.m. Eastern, if I have that correctly. The link is in the description box down there, so make sure that you're not missing it. Fantastic series. We go over some of the real stories that come out of the corruption of our financial institutions and how those affect everyday people in incredibly negative ways. So want to make sure nobody's missing out on that series. It's a lot of work, and it's really bringing important stories to the people and connecting the dots in terms of what the corruption in our systems lead to in terms of everyday people and their inability to live as fulfilling lives as they would like. So please don't miss the new Untouchables dropping at 8. We're going to have some clips to show you. In fact, let's just go ahead and show you one of these right now. This is a little teaser of that episode. So take a look, enjoy.
We both were involved in the sentencing hearing of Lorraine Brown with LPS DocX, where they are talking about people sitting around tables using bad notary stamps and signing all these names to documents, as people who live in our local communities are calling mortgage servicers and finding out, okay, now who is servicing my loan and why did things change?
Just a little teaser there. Make sure you're not missing out on these episodes, you guys. Really fantastic series. And we have all sorts of other fantastic content as well on Real Progressives and Real Progress in Action. Also want to make sure everybody's following both of our YouTube channels. Some people seem to only think we have one. There is Real Progress in Action, which I'm live on right now. There's also Real Progressives. So make sure that you're subscribed to both. Please smash that like button. Leave a comment, guys. Let me know what you think. Try to help us defeat the YouTube algorithm, if you will. Wanted to start today with a rather, I should say, all too common story, I suppose. This is a tweet about Nancy Pelosi's position on student loan debt. She says, quote, "Suppose your child just decided they, at this time, do not want to go to college, but you're paying taxes to forgive somebody else's obligations. You may not be happy about that." Now, there's a number of issues with this. First of all, it's economically illiterate. Federal taxes do not pay for federal spending. So when we're talking about student debt relief or tuition-free college, it's not going to cost taxpayers anything. That's just complete and utter nonsense. It's illiterate. It's spending that must come first by definition before any of us have the dollars to pay our taxes with. So the question is not whether or not taxpayers should foot the bill. It's whether or not Congress should authorize spending to take some burden off of people's financial lives. Okay, really simple. But the other thing about this, she's using a brazenly right-wing talking point, you guys. This it really far right, insane talking point. This idea that we should be so hyper individual and selfish as to not want to use public policy and resources to help society as a whole. I mean, this is the same kind of, would you say, well, I'm not going to drive on that road, so I don't want public dollars to be spent on it. Fuck everybody else who needs to drive on that road. Would you say that? Or would you realize that that comes off quite crass and barbaric? That's Pelosi's take here on student debt relief, that to each their own, fuck having a society, right? Like it just insane far-right nonsense coming from the supposed Democratic leader of the House. I retweeted this and said, Pelosi brazenly and intentionally lying about the monetary system. I see lefties retweeting this saying shit like, my tax dollars go to war already. Why not this? Please stop buying into the tax to spend lie. Please stop using inaccurate neoliberal framing. Learn MMT. And you guys, this is one of the most frustrating things that I see in politics is people who have genuinely progressive political views and policy positions using economically illiterate language that arms and provides ammunition to our enemies, who then get to use that tax to spend framework, to oppose all of our progressive policy prescriptions. I see lefties talking about this all the time. I'll pick on Kyle Kulinski, who I generally really do like. Kyle was an influence on getting me into media. But he has both acknowledged on numerous occasions that MMT is correct about this stuff and has acknowledged that taxes don't pay for spending at the federal level. And then he continues to use that neoliberal language. It's not just Kyle. I'm picking on Kyle, but a lot of lefties do this. And he tweeted out too, something about how tax dollars go to war and corporate tax breaks and all this kind of stuff. It's like, no. Stop buying into their framework that allows them to kind of have the home turf of these policy discussions. We just need to acknowledge the reality, call it public dollars, you guys. For those who say, like, what do I call it then? It's so deeply ingrained in our rhetoric. What do I call it? Public dollars, federal spending. Either of those is just fine. Congress authorizes the spending and then it happens. It is not tax dollars. So just wanted to plead lefties to stop using language that does your cause a serious disservice. The big story right now, obviously, is the eviction moratorium being lifted. So we're now likely to have an eviction crisis with millions of Americans potentially being thrown out of their homes. This is in the Associated Press. Tenants prepare for unknown as eviction moratorium ends. Tenants saddled with months of back rent are facing the end of the federal eviction moratorium Saturday, a move that could lead to millions being forced from their homes, just as the highly contagious Delta variant of the coronavirus is rapidly spreading. The Biden administration announced Thursday it would allow the nationwide ban to expire, saying it wanted to extend it due to rising infections, but its hands were tied after the U.S. Supreme Court signaled in June that it wouldn't be extended beyond the end of July without congressional action. House lawmakers on Friday attempted but failed to pass a bill to extend the moratorium even for a few months. Some Democratic lawmakers had wanted to extend it until the end of the year. August is going to be a rough month because a lot of people will be displaced from their homes, said Jeffrey Hearn, director of litigation legal services of Greater Miami, Inc. It will be at numbers we haven't seen before. There are a lot of people who are protected by the moratorium. So you guys, this is something that was conveniently ignored by the mainstream media, by both political parties, by Congress, by the powers that be, by the Biden administration, etc. They did not mention that this was coming. They said nothing about it until pretty much the day of. Now, there were some progressive members of Congress who spoke out about this, again, kind of at the last minute, but they at least spoke out about this. AOC and Cori Bush and others who chastised Congress for going on vacation while a bunch of people are about to be kicked out of their homes. But it was just too little too late. And, the fact that this was so ignored by everybody is insane to me. I mean, it's just absolutely insane. We're going to sit here and talk about the fucking January 6th commission for months on end, and while we ignore that millions of Americans might be forced out of their fucking houses during a pandemic, during a time of economic turmoil for many people at the bottom of the economy. We're just going to ignore this. I mean, it is totally and completely insane. I was rather blown away by the lack of coverage on this, even from the mainstream press, which I obviously am no fan of. But you would think in a situation like this, they might find a way to twist the narrative in their favor. But I did not think it would be just entirely ignored to this degree. And that's exactly what unfortunately has happened. So shame on the mainstream media, shame on both political parties, shame on anybody who did not do everything that they could to halt this. Congress now on vacation for weeks and weeks and weeks. And we're going to get to later. I have a piece about Kristen Sinema, who basically prioritized her own vacation above the needs of millions of Americans. Actually, I have quite a bit to talk about Kristen Sinema with today, but that is to come later. So another story here about the military industrial complex, you guys, and we will keep up on that eviction story, by the way. I'm sure that is not the end of that. I shudder to think what kind of news is going to be coming out this week, but we'll keep up with that coverage as well. And actually to plug again the new Untouchables, one of those episodes we put out was about Cindy Brown being evicted from her house quite forcefully and violently. She's a gold medalist at the Olympics. She was a basketball player and was forced out of her home. She's been living in her car for months. It's just devastating, the kind of stuff that is revealed in the series. Please make sure you're not missing the new Untouchables. So as I was saying, this is about the military-industrial complex. This is in the Hill. Biden administration approves $3.4 billion of helicopter sales to Israel. So we've talked quite a bit about the horrendous atrocities which Israel inflicts upon the Palestinian people, the ethnic cleansing that they have engaged in for decades, and the violent escalation that occurred just months ago and really has not totally, there was a so-called agreement or ceasefire that was put in place, but it really, it wasn't it did not actually halt the violence entirely, is the way that I would put it. Israel has continued to engage in illegal occupations, illegal settlements. They've even continued to, on occasion, use direct force against the Palestinians. So it's not as though that ceasefire means that all is well for those who are living in Palestine. And we talked a little bit about Naftali Bennett is the new prime minister in Israel, and how extreme his views are, even compared to Netanyahu, who was quite awful. Naftali Bennett had given an interview with Mehdi Hassan a couple of years back. I think it was 2017 or 2018 or something like that. It was just a few years ago. And he basically all but admitted that he prioritizes the Torah over his country's Supreme Court. And Mehdi kept saying, are you a theocracy now? You're saying that your religious texts take priority over your Supreme Court? And Naftali kind of dodged the question and basically told Mehdi to go rewrite the Bible if he wanted Bennett's position to change. It was quite a unhinged and terrifying interview, quite frankly. And the Biden administration continuing to tepidly endorse Israel's war crimes by continuing to support them, by refusing to condemn them, by continuing to be the backbone that allows Israel to continue this behavior, both in a financial and military sense, in that we provide them with financial aid and with lots of weapons, but also in the sense that geopolitically Israel is often condemned by, rather unanimously by the United Nations, and the United States is often the only country who stands by Israel, or one of the only countries that stands by Israel. United States often using our veto power to veto resolutions that would publicly condemn Israel for their war crimes, their illegal settlements and occupations, and their ethnic cleansing. So this is kind of where a military-industrial complex meets the atrocities that we have contributed to in Israel. $3.4 billion in helicopter sales. The State Department has approved selling Israel up to 18 CH-53K heavy lift cargo helicopters in a deal estimated to be worth $3.4 billion, according to a notice released Friday. Quote, the United States is committed to the security of Israel, and it is vital to U.S. national interest to assist Israel and develop and maintain a strong and ready self-defense capability. This proposed sale is consistent with those objectives, the notice from the Defense Security Cooperation Agency said. In addition to the Lockheed Martin-made helicopters, the deal would include related equipment, including up to 60 General Electric-made engines, up to 36 navigation systems, communication equipment, 50 caliber machine guns, and more, as well as technical and logistical support. The sale would help the Israeli Air Force's capability to transport armored vehicles, personnel, and equipment to support distributed operations, the notice said. So, it's interesting to me that they actually quote the companies as though that makes it good. They like as though, they do this like, oh, American made or something rather. And that's the problem, you guys. Like, that is literally that's them admitting the problem. That is the military-industrial complex. That Lockheed Martin and General Electric and Boeing and Raytheon and all these others get to make such massive profits off of our atrocities is the fucking problem. But in the United States media, that gets portrayed as a positive, as though it's like, well, it's jobs. I'll never forget a clip I saw of Wolf Blitzer, one of the worst individuals on cable news, and that is quite a low bar. So congratulations to Wolf. But he basically, in response to somebody condemning the military-industrial complex, he responded by effectively saying, but what about the jobs? As though we as a nation with control over a fiat currency, as though we don't have the capacity to create other jobs. Like, we must allow war crimes and engage in war crimes, because otherwise some people might not have jobs. And also, do you ever hear Wolf or anyone else on cable news complaining about the millions of people who currently do not have jobs? No, because it's not really about that. It's about upholding the structures that allow CNN to make their profits. How often, you guys, when you're watching cable news, do you see like a Boeing ad? I mean, like really think about this. Think about this. Does Boeing make a single product that you can buy, that you can afford to buy? Of course not. They're not advertising to you because they want you to buy a 737, right? Like it's not about that. They're doing first of all, it's about making their name recognizable and in a positive light. But secondly, and more importantly, they are buying favor with the network that they're advertising on. So they're paying millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands or whatever to these cable news networks so that when a foreign policy issue comes up, it's covered in a way that is beneficial to Boeing's bottom line. That is to say, they're not going to be critical of the United States engagement in these kinds of things or weapon sales to other countries that are engaging in atrocities. Instead, we're going to back the line of the United States, Department of Defense, and we're going to treat the Pentagon's word as though it's objective truth, right? And the State Department's word as though it's objective truth, because our advertisers rely on those contracts. So you see how they're basically buying off the media by spending all of this money on advertising when there is not a single product that Boeing makes that you or I can afford. Anyone out there, can you buy a 737? Tens of millions of dollars? No, of course you can't. So when you really think through what's actually happening here, it's influence peddling. They're purchasing influence in a major media outlet. And that is why an outlet like The Hill here will portray it in the most positive possible light and not go on to mention that those helicopters will be used to contribute to an ethnic cleansing campaign, to an effective genocide, to illegal settlements, illegal occupations, barbarity inflicted against women and children and protesters, bombing media outlets, bombing hospitals. They took out the one COVID testing facility in Palestine, just on and on and on. These are war crimes, and they are not even debatable. These are war crimes by a mile. Okay, Netanyahu and Bennett and all of the U.S. presidents who have endorsed this belong at The Hague. That's all there is to it. Okay, but The Hill is not going to portray it like that, because The Hill is a mainstream outlet that is participating in the military-industrial complex just like many other mainstream outlets do. I told you we wanted to talk a little bit about Kyrsten Sinema today. She's obviously, her and Manchin are the Republican gatekeepers who put a D next to their name, and then obstruct even the things the Democrats want to do, which in my view are grossly inadequate to start with, but often at least a tiny step in the right direction that is then obstructed by Manchin and Sinema. Things like a $15 minimum wage, things like any climate action being part of the infrastructure bill, which we're going to get into later. These two senators in particular, there are a number of other Democrats who are quite conservative, don't get me wrong, but these two have seemed to kind of embrace the showmanship of opposing their own party and cosplaying bipartisanship, as Brianna Joy Gray so eloquently put it. It's all theater, it's all nonsense, and it's all so that they can go back to their largely red states and say, see, we're not far left, it's just political theater is really all that it boils down to. This is a piece in Mother Jones. New poll: Arizona Democrats love Biden and Kelly. Kyrsten Sinema. I think I always call her Kristen. I've been mispronouncing her name this whole time. Kyrsten Sinema, not so much. These kinds of numbers could encourage a serious primary challenge from the left. Senator Kyrsten Sinema's support for the Senate filibuster appears to be doing real damage to her political brand back home. The first-term Arizona Democrat has often defended the Senate's 60-vote supermajority requirement as a necessary check on partisan whiplash, arguing that it forces the chamber to put together durable coalitions. But according to a new survey shared with Mother Jones from the progressive polling and policy firm Data for Progress, her stance has left her far less popular in Arizona than either President Joe Biden or her recently elected Senate colleague Mark Kelly, and perhaps even vulnerable to a primary challenge. According to the survey, which was conducted from June 28th to June 6th, Sinema is viewed favorably by 38% of voters, compared to 47% for Kelly and 51% for Biden, all of whom were elected in recent years by similar margins to Sinema. Republican Governor Doug Ducey's favorability sits at 44%. The numbers are more stark when you look at the partisan breakdown. Sinema is viewed favorably by just 42% of Democrats, with 39% viewing her unfavorably, while Kelly, who was elected narrowly last fall, is at 75% favorability, with just 17% viewing him unfavorably. Biden, he's doing just fine according to Arizona Democrats, with 95% viewing him positively. And guys, obviously Joe Biden is not like some far left dude. He's pretty fucking conservative himself, but even he is more popular than Sinema by a wide margin. Also, Mark Kelly, not exactly a left winger. Okay, but Mark Kelly is at least not obstructing what the Democrats are trying to do in the same manner that Sinema is, and you see the results in public opinion there. This really punches a hole in the establishment narrative that you cannot be progressive in a purple or red state. It is not true, you guys. Let's just go down some of the items on the progressive agenda. Okay, 75% support Medicare for all. Over 90% want money out of politics. Over 80% want a federal jobs guarantee. Okay, like these are not issues that are going to further divide us. They're actually unifying issues across party lines. Some half of Republicans support Medicare for all, you guys. A vast majority of Republicans want money out of politics. Okay, a majority of Republicans support a federal jobs guarantee. Will Sinema fight for any of those things? No, she will obstruct them. Over 70% want a raise in the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Sinema herself was one of the only people to obstruct that. You guys remember the curtsy and the thumbs down vote? That's Kyrsten Sinema. She's a Republican gatekeeper. It's what she does. Joe Manchin too, and we're going to get into some of his corruption a little bit later on here. But it's very much worth noting that even though Biden and Kelly are not exactly progressive stalwarts, they are significantly more popular in the state of Arizona than Kyrsten Sinema is. This just annihilates the narrative that you must be conservative to win purple states, that the Democrats cannot run progressive candidates and win purple states. You know what actually stinks to Republican voters and independent voters? The elitism of the Democratic establishment. That's what they actually are turned off by. It's not the policy. You can talk progressive policy because that's actually talking to the working class and saying we're going to uplift you and improve your life and give you an ability to live a more fulfilling life. You not only can do that, you will succeed doing that. Okay? What stinks to these voters is the connection to the establishment. So when Sinema and Manchin cosplay bipartisanship, I just love that term. Shout out to Brianna Joy Gray for that one. When they do that, they begin to reek of that elitism and of that insider and establishment and classic DC nonsense. And when you participate in that, voters are going to view you quite unfavorably. So in many ways, the establishment has this totally backwards. Okay. Now, I concede there are some issues that are not yet popular among the voter base, right? Like the phrase defund the police is not yet popular among the voter base. Just like throughout history, every movement has had to plant seeds and grow some roots and explain to the public, here's what we mean, here's why we believe it, here's why we think you should support this, right? And that will happen in my view. But the overall narrative that lefties are being too extreme and costing the Democrats elections and seats, it's complete nonsense. It's just utter nonsense. It's not backed up by the data. It's not backed up by the response of voters to people like Kyrsten Sinema. Okay, she's demonstrating here that voters do not want the gridlock and the bipartisan bullshit. You think anybody cares? You guys, when we look back at like the Civil Rights Act, does anybody go, well, how many Republicans voted for it? No one gives a fuck. Okay, if we pass a reconciliation bill in infrastructure that actually does some good things, do you think people are going to look back and go like, well, I don't know, did Marco Rubio vote for it? Seems like it wasn't bipartisan. I don't want to accept this help to my life. I'm going to turn down the job that I need, or the child tax credit, or whatever, or the, universal pre-K or whatever. I'm going to turn it down because no Republican voted for it. It's so absurd. It's not rooted in reality. It's DC brain rot that leads these people to think that they have to put on this theatrical show. What you need to do is help your fucking constituents. That's what you need to do. You want to get reelected, provide them with jobs, provide them with health care, okay? Help lift them out of the economic crisis that has resulted from this pandemic and that neoliberalism has inflicted upon us for decades. That's what you need to do. Provide, cancel student debt. Provide them with the ability to go to college if they want. That's what you need to do. It's really not complicated whatsoever, but they twist themselves up into these fucking pretzels of DC brain rot and then think that they have to work with Republicans if they're going to maintain their seat. It's insane. It's insane. It's insane. And as you see here, even characters that I do not think are very successful characters or very helpful characters like Joe Biden and Mark Kelly end up polling significantly better because they at least do not support the obstruction of their own party. And, Sinema and Manchin seem all too proud and happy and thrilled to support the obstruction of their own party's agenda. Just absolutely insane. Apologies for my camera app. Be back in just a second. One more topic here that I wanted to get to before we bring in my guest today. This story in Haiti, I've talked about this the last few weeks. It's really a rather insane situation there with Jovenel Moïse being assassinated weeks ago. And it was already a country in political turmoil because Moïse had overstayed his term and was rewriting the constitution, had disallowed elections from happening. So their Congress was not, it was quite empty, only 10 of 30 senators. They're supposed to have 30. They only have 10 sitting senators because he has not allowed for elections to occur, on and on, right? One of the constitutions called for the Chief Justice to replace him. Chief Justice died about weeks before Moïse was assassinated. He died of COVID. So like this situation is in political turmoil. But as the United States does in virtually every situation around the globe of that political turmoil, they are now getting involved. Just as they were previously, they supported the Moïse regime and supported Moïse overstaying his term, which, I just want to point out, like, can you guys imagine if that was Russia or Iran or someone like supporting another country's leader who was overstaying their term? Can you even imagine what the United States media would do with those headlines? But when we do it, it's okay. It's, inherently we're the good guys, blah, 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 right? The American exceptionalism bullshit. This is in the New York Times. Battle for power in Haiti extends to lobbying in Washington. Rival political figures and interests are doling out big sums to the influence industry to win support from the United States, even as problems in Haiti remain unsolved. The struggle for power in Haiti after the assassination of the country's president has spilled into K Street, where rival Haitian politicians, business leaders, and interest groups are turning to lobbyists to wage an expensive and escalating proxy battle for influence with the United States. Documents, interviews, and communications among Haitian politicians and officials show a scramble across a wide spectrum of Haitian interests to hire lobbyists and consultants in Washington and use those already on their payrolls in the hopes of winning American backing in a period of leadership turmoil in Haiti. A group text in the days after the killing of President Jovenel Moïse that included Haitian officials, political figures, and American lobbyists showed them strategizing about countering American critics and potential rivals for the presidency and looking for ways to cast blame for the killing, according to copies of the messages obtained by the New York Times and confirmed by some of the participants. The chat began before the assassination and originally included Mr. Moïse, though it appeared to take on a more frenetic tone after he was gunned down in his home this month. So they go into details where you basically have people in Washington, D.C. taking sides on this and people in Haiti who may have a claim to power or would like to have a claim to power, frantically trying to basically buy influence in the United States. So again, you guys, like I take this exact same story and just replace the characters, okay? So instead of Haiti being in political turmoil and Washington, D.C. being the target of all of this lobbying and all of this influence peddling, imagine if the United States or one of our close allies was in political turmoil and it was Tehran or Moscow that was influence peddling about who was going to take power in the United States or in the country, in one of our ally countries. Just imagine. We would have had 4 fucking years of Russiagate if that report came out. We would have had another 4 years of cable news. Oh, Putin influencing elections. Like the hypocrisy, the rank hypocrisy cannot possibly be overstated. While the United States is hand-wringing about the Cuban government, this is going on. I mean, you can't dish up. I couldn't write a fiction book that had this kind of nonsense in it. It's absurd. The contradictions, the hypocrisy, beyond absurd. And it looks like the United States will maintain its kind of stranglehold over the political happenings in Haiti. We had originally Claude Joseph was prime minister. He, right before Moïse was assassinated, he had replaced Claude Joseph with Ariel Henry. And Ariel Henry was set to take the prime minister's seat the week after Moise was murdered. So like all of this, it's just leading to a chaotic situation of gargantuan proportions, and it's very hard to know what's going on down there because there's so much corruption, and everybody who's reporting on this seems to have their own incentive, their own angle, right? So it's just a very difficult story to try to gauge. And on that note, you guys, like, why would the United States we don't even know yet who was behind that assassination. The United States may very well here be influencing politics in Haiti in a direction where somebody who was involved could seize power. We don't know. They may very well be one of the people that is talked about being his replacement is the head of the Senate. And there are other people in Haiti who are trying to position themselves to be the next president. Well, what if one of them was involved in the assassination and then immediately pivoted to trying to influence the United States on this? And yet here we are just, as though it's our business, attempting to push pieces around in Haiti and have our influence on what they do with their fucking country. It's insane. I really don't know. That it can be overstated how hypocritical the United States is about these issues. Apologies, you guys. It looks like my guest today did not get the link to the stream. I'm trying to bring him in. Give me just a second. I really do apologize. Anyhow, yeah, I want everybody to take note. I've used this term before, but the Chomsky rule is usually applied to foreign policy. If you switch the actors and maintain the situation and your opinion changes, you're being a hypocrite. It's really simple. So if we're talking about Cuba and then we're talking about Haiti, and you completely flip on a dime whether you think that the United States should be involved, whether you think that that government is good or bad, etc., you're being a hypocrite. It's so obvious it shouldn't need to be said, but it clearly does based upon the United States actions around the world. At this point, I would like to bring in my guest today. Shervin Aazami is running for Congress in California. Shervin, thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Of course. Hi there, Luke. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I got you loud and clear.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. First of all, can you give me your website where people can find out information about your campaign if they're interested?
Of course. Our website is Shervin. My name's Shervin, the number 4, thevalley.com. Again, my name is Shervin Aazami. I'm a father. I'm a husband. I'm a public health activist, community organizer, and immigrant running for U.S. Congress in my hometown, San Fernando Valley, California's 30th district. I'm also a former legislative director on Capitol Hill, fighting to make sure the federal government honors its treaty obligations to tribal nations for healthcare. So thank you so much again, Luke, for having me on, and thank you to your viewers.
Yeah, and I wanted to start by kind of picking up where on a topic you were mentioning. You were at the was it the LA rally? Do I have that right?
Yes, for Medicare for all.
Medicare for all.
That's
yeah,
right.
Yeah. And we showed a portion of, for those who caught our coverage of the live streams, we showed a portion of Shervin's speech where he was talking about how these are choices, explicit policy choices, right? The leaving 500,000 plus homeless every night, that's a policy choice. Leaving people without health coverage, that's a policy choice. Choosing to not address the climate crisis, that's a policy choice. These are all explicit decisions that Congress makes. We know this because they have the power of the purse. Can you just speak a little bit to how dysfunctional the state of Washington, D.C. is, and how we end up with a political environment where those kind of choices are not just made, but are considered mainstream and normal, and it's almost considered extreme to sort of push back against them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we live in a world where it's radical to say that every human being should have housing and healthcare as inherent human rights. We live in a world where it's radical to think that clean air and water are inherent human rights. And all that goes back to the dysfunction in Washington that you're talking about, Luke. We have this revolving door between corporations and our politicians, and that dictates the policies that are prioritized and the policies that are passed, ones that maximize profits for corporations and their shareholders at the expense of the vast majority of the American people. So poverty is indeed a policy choice. And budgets absolutely reflect priorities. I talked about that during the Medicare for All March, where we could eradicate homelessness with just 10% of the Pentagon's budget. But our legislators choose not to each and every single year. And, the story of the day, of course, is with the eviction moratorium that the Democrats in Congress allowed to expire last night, where now we have 15 million Americans, half of them children, that are on the verge of eviction during a pandemic that has roiled working class communities across the entire country. And we see that millions of Americans are roughly $4,000 to $5,000 behind on their rent and utilities payments. And Congress could not move fast enough to extend that eviction moratorium. At the same time, the roughly $50 billion in rental assistance that Congress already appropriated, only about less than 7% of that has trickled down at the state and local level. So there's all this bureaucratic delay that is not allowing people to stay in their homes. But on the topic of the eviction moratorium specifically, I mean, this is truly just self-sabotage. It's not like the expiration was any kind of surprise for anyone in Congress. And yet the Speaker and Majority Leader Hoyer waited until the very last minute to bring up a bill under unanimous consent for a vote right before the House was set to adjourn, and when you already had conservative Dems fuming and leaving town. And so under a UC vote, of course, anyone objection, it tanks the bill. And so, of course, Republicans came out against it, and that gave the Speaker leverage as basically an off-ramp to say, all right, we got to finger point at the Republicans now, when no, you're the one in charge. You are the Speaker. You did not whip votes leading up to this Friday. You did not demand that everyone stay in town, your caucus stay in town until this was passed, which you totally had the authority to do. Instead, you wanted to turn the Republicans into scapegoats here. And look, I'm not here defending Republicans, but the power is in the hands of the Democrats.
Yeah, and when you're making a choice where you know what the result is going to be, right? When she chooses to do this by unanimous consent, she knew full well that not just one Republican was going to object, but that all of them were going to object.
Right.
So when you make that choice, you're already choosing that you're not going to address the problem, as opposed to actually using the power that you have. And on that kind of note, if you were to make it into Congress, how would you use that seat to how would you use your power in a way that the Democrats seem almost entirely unwilling to, even on the few areas where they're actually progressive? And to your point that it's self-sabotage, these are not issues that are controversial. Right. So when we're talking about a $15 minimum wage that has over 70% approval in almost every poll that it goes through, right? Money out of politics, 90% of people approve of this, right? Like federal job guarantee, 80% approve of this stuff. So when we're talking about issues with this kind of approval in the country, why would you should be doing everything you can to own that and say that's ours, we did that, reelect us, right? So how would you use your power to fulfill the needs of Americans and also then politically help the progressive movement?
Politicians like my opponent Brad Sherman, who are fake progressives who sit there and will do the bare minimum on progressive bills while taking massive sums of money from the very corporations and lobbyists acting against passage of these bold structural reforms like single-payer Medicare for all, like a Green New Deal, like a homes guarantee, like divesting from the U.S. war machine. All these issues go back to, as you made the point, Luke, the American people want these structural changes. These are bold, popular policies. But instead, we have politicians that want to give lip service and virtue signal their support without actually advocating for these bold structural changes. And even with just basic stopgap measures, which is what the eviction moratorium is, it's a stopgap measure to keep people in their homes as we actually work to uplift and empower working people, build millions of affordable housing units, and enact living wages tied to regional cost of living. This was the bare minimum our Congress members could do. And instead, we saw people like my opponent, Brad Sherman, at the very end of the day on Friday, right before the House adjourned, tweet something out about co-sponsoring Cori Bush's bill without actually staying in town and advocating for it. Where were you calling on the Speaker to demand the caucus stay in town? Where were you calling on committee leaders to talk about this? Why weren't you getting on media? You're on Fox News all the time. You're on CNN all the time. Why aren't you on there talking about the eviction moratorium? Just because California has an extension here in place does not mean people are not falling through the cracks. We've seen over 8,000 households evicted here in California despite the eviction moratorium. So it's not even a full social safety net for people. And you're not actually bringing attention, you're not clamoring down the doors and advocating for these changes. You're just doing the bare minimum so you can go back to your community and give lip service. And that's what I'm sick and tired of.
I would totally agree.
Virtue signaling is more important than immediate direct action. You should have stayed in town and protested outside of the Capitol alongside Cori Bush and Ayanna Pressley and other progressives. But here's the thing, and I say this, and there may be people who will be upset with what I'm about to say. As much as I admire the activism of Representatives Bush, Ayanna Pressley, Ilhan Omar, and others, I can't help but ask myself, what would have been the outcome if they did this just a week earlier?
Yep.
2 weeks earlier.
It was too little too late. And like you said, we all knew this was coming since January, when this was like, so it's not like this was sprung upon us, right? This was built into a bill from months ago. We all knew it was coming. And to your point about lip service, I'm quite reminded of the whole $15 an hour ordeal, where Democrats were all too willing to fold to an advisor of the Senate, just to be really clear, parliamentarian, not an authority, not at all an authority. In fact, when the Bush administration and Republicans in the mid 2000s wanted to pass their tax cuts, and the parliamentarian said that can't be part of a reconciliation bill, what did they do? They fired him and replaced him. So I was always taught growing up, and I love this phrase, as cliche as it is, actions speak louder than words. I can call myself a vegetarian while I'm shoveling my mouth full of steak. It doesn't really make much difference, right? But I can virtue signal it. I can go tweet out how I'm a vegetarian while I'm where do you think that disconnect is? Do you think that is that pure corruption? Is that the culture in DC? How do you diagnose the sort of the difference between rhetoric and action among the Democratic Party?
Again, I think you hit the nail over the head. It boils down to people who want to step up to the plate, who do not want to step up to the plate and actually put in the bold actions we need to get these structural reforms passed. And, I saw this as an advocate myself on Capitol Hill, where again and again, Congress would wait to the very last minute to act when it came to funding the federal government, the one job Congress has at the exact same time each and every year. You got to pass a federal budget by September 30th. That's when the fiscal year ends. Yet again and again, for the past 40 years, there have only been a number of times where Congress has passed a full year budget on time. And every other year, we've seen a stopgap measure as Congress tries to get its act together and legislate on behalf of the American people. And so, again, it boils down to politicians that are occupying our seats on behalf of their corporate donors, people like Brad Sherman, who do not actually want to put in the work. We need bold advocates in Congress. I'm proud to say that I got more bills passed in 2 years as an advocate than Brad Sherman has in 24 years as a legislator. And one of the bills I'm most proud of is a bill that canceled copays and deductibles for Native American veterans, getting us one step closer to single-payer Medicare for all. And so we really need a revolution in our political system that's grounded in pure transparency and real co-governance, where the community is working in lockstep with the representatives to get bold policy changes passed, as opposed to representatives helicoptering in every now and then, holding town halls and making all the excuses for why they can't be the advocate. Oh, it's the corporation's fault. Oh, it's the speaker's fault. We elected you. Do your job. If there are barriers in play, as there always are, be transparent about them.
Yeah.
Work with the community. Say, these are the actual steps we need to take. These are the offices we need to call. This is where we need to protest. This is what we need to do to get these changes in. That's what we did as advocates on Capitol Hill, and we were successful. So we need representatives to put their money where their mouth is and actually act on getting these structural reforms passed.
I 100% in agreement on that one. And, I'm reminded of something Bernie said on the campaign where he, we see this kind of obstruction from Manchin and Sinema, who will kind of gatekeep for the Republicans. And then the rest of the Democratic establishment doesn't really have to take the heat, right? They can say, I support X, Y, or Z, but look, we just can't. I don't know what to tell you. Right. So Bernie was asked about this. He was asked kind of, basically people would try to push to him, you're left of your colleagues. How are you going to get things done? And he basically said, I will go to West Virginia.
Yep.
And I will use the bully pulpit to point out what Joe Manchin is doing and how my policy would help the people and how he's obstructing it. So that is to me the answer is actually use that power of public narrative to your benefit. But it seems like the Democrats are unwilling. Can you just kind of go into some of the details of what's your district like?
Sure.
What is your opponent like? Can you kind of explain what Sherman's history is, what kind of politician he is, and why you're running against him?
Absolutely. So the 30th district, it's the West San Fernando Valley, part of Los Angeles. Our district is over 484,000 voters, very, very culturally and ethnically diverse. Roughly 40% of our district residents are foreign born. A little over a third are Latinx. And our district is ground zero for so many of our socioeconomic issues across the country. We are ground zero for our national housing and homelessness crisis. We have 5 unhoused neighbors die per day in Los Angeles. And like every issue, this issue falls along racial fault lines, where Black Angelenos are 8% of our city population, but 34% of are unhoused. And just at the federal level, we're also seeing at the local level, more and more money go into criminalization and forced displacement and incarceration of unhoused people, literally criminalizing poverty, as opposed to providing the basic human needs people have to survive and thrive. We just saw that with the city of LA passing an ordinance 4118 to openly criminalize sitting, sleeping, or lying in the vast majority of places in the city, as opposed to taking advantage of federal funds from FEMA to fully shelter folks in hotels, at least for the duration of the pandemic. We're not even seeing them invest in those stopgap measures. Again, instead, all that money going towards criminalization. Now, in our district, we're also ground zero for our affordable housing crisis. Right now, the median price for a home in the San Fernando Valley is just under $1 million, $955,000. So if you're a minimum wage worker, if you're a retail worker, a grocery worker, people that we call essential workers, yet we don't pay them living wages to actually survive. I mean, that is just an abomination. That is so incredibly immoral and a cancer on our society that the wealthiest nation in the world cannot guarantee these fundamental human rights. And instead, what we're seeing now is 1 in 5 single-family homes are being bought by Wall Street firms, by corporate landlords like BlackRock and Blackstone, creating an entirely new housing crisis because of these private equity firms buying up these homes, flipping them, and increasing the cost of the market. At the same time, our district is ground zero for our climate crisis. The largest natural gas blowout in U.S. history happened in our district at Aliso Canyon back in 2015. 109,000 metric tons of methane were dumped into the air, causing so many different types of physical ailments across the entire area, from nosebleeds to rates of asthma to headaches and all kinds of issues for our family members and friends all across the district. We're also the site of one of the largest nuclear meltdowns in U.S. history. And LA has the worst ozone pollution in the country. Here in LA, we also have over a third of our state's 3.4 million uninsured residing in our local district. So these are huge, huge issues. And the incumbent, Brad Sherman, has been in office for 24 years. He's gotten 2 bills passed in that time, one under Bush, the other under Trump, one of which was a name change to a post office in our district.
Oh, that's the classic. You got to be kidding me. That's
Truly,
literally the classic, like, do nothing bill that you can then go back and say, I passed some.
Absolutely. And again, he will do the bare minimum. He'll co-sponsor Medicare for all. He'll co-sponsor the Green New Deal. But again, he is overwhelmingly financed by the very corporations working against passage of Medicare for all and the Green New Deal. So he's literally just co-sponsoring these bills to fend off a primary challenger. We live in a D+18 district that Bernie Sanders won with 44,000 votes during the presidential primary. There is no political downside for Brad Sherman to be the bold progressive advocate we need him to be. But after 24 years in office, he has not shown himself to be an advocate for anything beyond his corporate donors.
Yeah, that's what corruption does to you, right? When you start taking that corporate cash, you end up doing their bidding, and you can very easily kneecap a bill while you pretend to support it. We see this all too often. We were just talking about Sinema and Manchin, same kind of deal. I was going to ask you about I'm often somewhat confused about California politics in the sense that in my experience, which I grant you is limited, I did volunteer for Bernie in San Francisco for a week or so, but all of the people I spoke to at the door, and I grant you that's probably a progressive district, but they were quite on board with a progressive agenda and quite liked what Bernie had to say in terms of what we need to do going forward. And yet I then see the Democratic Party in the state seeming to be quite establishment, right? Like Gavin Newsom will run on a green campaign and he'll talk a lot about the climate crisis while he's running, but then he starts granting all these new drilling permits and these kinds of things. So can you talk a little bit about the California political environment and where maybe I'm confused there? What's the disconnect?
You know, California is branded as the most progressive state in the entire country. And there are a lot of things that we do right, but there are a lot of things that we do wrong as well. And the establishment here in the state, just like the establishment across the country, they are bought and paid for by their corporate donors. We even saw this with the chair of our progressive party here in California, who took the no fossil fuel money pledge, but then took hundreds of thousands of dollars from energy companies like Semper. And you brought up the governor as well. He also campaigned on single-payer Medicare for all. And we have a single-payer bill here in California, AB 1400, yet twice now the legislature has shelved it. So we need to see action. It is so easy to brand yourself as a progressive. It is much harder to actually put in the work and advocate for these bold structural reforms. And that goes back to why we need corporate-free progressives running and winning up and down the ballot. That's the only way we're going to be successful in seeing these bold policy changes enacted. Because here in California, we have a lot of politicians that say they're progressive, but they're financed by health insurance, by big pharma, by weapons manufacturers, by fossil fuel companies, and they are doing their bidding largely as our elected officials. And that's one of the reasons why our campaign has made concerted efforts to work with real progressives running up and down the ballot, from state assembly to city council, because we recognize we have to work together and build that solidarity if we're going to be successful at enacting single-payer Medicare for all, at enacting a Green New Deal, and so on and so forth. So it's going to be really, really important here in our state as well for progressives to really unite behind the policies we are all working on. Leave the riffraff aside and work together at getting these things enacted. And that means electing as many corporate-free politicians as possible.
Yeah, I'm in pure agreement with that one. So as far as like, I want to ask you about power and leverage a little bit here. So with something like this infrastructure bill and the reconciliation, we're starting to see some progressives. Bernie actually said he was interviewed by Crystal Ball, and he basically said, "I will do what I can to tank the bipartisan bill if there's not assurances that we're going to get the reconciliation bill." Now, even the 3.5 trillion I view as inadequate. I'm not going to get my way on this one. We need like 10 trillion just to get up to par, but I'm not going to get my way on this one, right? The 3.5 trillion does have some good things in it. It has universal pre-K. It addresses some of the environmental issues, these kinds of things. So if you were presented with this opportunity in Congress, would you be willing to put your foot down and say, I'm not passing the bipartisan bill unless we have assurances for the reconciliation?
Yeah. Without question.
Okay. And then more broadly, how do you think that kind of power should and could be utilized by progressives in Congress?
Yeah, absolutely. And to kind of touch on this, it's important to go back to what we've seen the administration and Congress do so far. We talked about this earlier, where Biden campaigned on a $15 minimum wage. It's literally why the state of Georgia was won by the Democrats. People campaigned on raising the wage. And we saw the Biden administration drop like a hot potato as soon as they saw Republican resistance. The same thing was happening with the American Rescue Plan, where Biden kept reducing the overall price tag of the package to try and appease Republicans who ended up not voting for it anyway. Mm-hmm. And so we're seeing that again now with the American Families Plan, with the infrastructure package, and with this $3.5 trillion reconciliation package, where we first saw it be proposed at roughly, I believe it was $2.2 billion, and now it's down to 500 something billion. And so much of the funding for schools, for housing, for home and community-based care, for clean energy tax credits, for R&D and manufacturing, so many of these important climate-related, housing-related, childcare-related priorities have dwindled down to zero. And in an effort to appease Republicans, we also saw Democrats throw away a set of tax packages to make sure the IRS is fully funded to go after billionaires and corporations that have been dodging their tax liabilities for years. Another giveaway to the Republicans. So it's despicable to see during a moment after a year that has roiled American people, where millions have lost their employer-sponsored healthcare coverage, millions have lost their wages, their homes, their jobs. This has to be our clarion call for single-payer Medicare for all, for a homes guarantee, for bold trillion-dollar investments in clean air and water, and transition to 100% renewable energy economy, for living wages. And we're not seeing enough pressure. We're not seeing enough advocacy, enough intensity in the work that Democrats are doing on Capitol Hill. And this also kind of dovetails well with protecting and strengthening voting rights going into the 2022 midterm, where we know historically the incumbent party is always decimated. And so in this moment where we know that it was the Black vote, the Indigenous vote, and the Latinx vote that delivered the White House, the House of Representatives, and the Senate to the Democrats, this should be our moment for the Democrats to say, let's abolish the filibuster, that Jim Crow relic, and pass the For the People Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, DC statehood. Let's actually protect the Black vote, not just try to solicit the Black vote and not actually protect it when we're in power. So again and again, it's lip service minus action. And so for us, again, I'm happy to see at least now progressives like Bernie, like AOC and others are saying that we're not going to vote. We're going to withhold our vote for the infrastructure deal without a bold reconciliation package. But we need to see that leverage on the infrastructure vote itself, because at the end of the day, progressives do have real power here. The Democrats only have a few vote majority in the House. And so a number of progressives saying we're not going to vote for this could very well tank it. Let's exercise that power and demand bold changes for the American people. When the Republicans are in charge, do you think they care about bipartisanship? Do you think Mitch McConnell and McCarthy cared about bipartisanship when they passed a $2 trillion deficit finance tax cuts package back in 2018? Or when they were trying to gut the Affordable Care Act and take away healthcare from 20 million people? Do you think they cared about bipartisanship? And in that same vein, when the Republicans were destroyed in the 2018 midterms, do you think they attacked their base? But what did the Democrats do in 2020 when they lost a few seats? Oh, it's the defund the police rhetoric. It's the Medicare for all rhetoric. They eat their own base.
Yeah. And by the way, what was actually effective, I've seen a number of studies on this. The ads that were actually most effective and have been effective for over a decade are ads against Nancy Pelosi. The Republican Party very openly runs across the country, not against their opponent, against Nancy Pelosi. Right. So if we're actually going to have a conversation here about why the Democrats fail so often in the electoral realm, I think that has to be a significant part of the conversation. And to your point, the Tea Party never hesitated to use their leverage. Right. John Boehner and Paul Ryan absolutely despised the Tea Party because the Tea Party despised them and exercised power against them, right? Yet progressives, it seems, are unwilling to use their dozen or so votes in the House to exercise that same kind of power. The story, I've told this one before, but when Biden was vice president, he was heading up negotiations for the Obama administration with John Boehner. Boehner famously said to him, after Biden gave some spiel, I don't even remember what the topic was, but he gave his spiel. Here's what we want. Here's what we need. Boehner famously replied, "You act like I care." That's the person that you are trying to theatrically negotiate with, right? While people are struggling, while people are dying, while people are homeless, while people lack healthcare. So how do we get progressives, to exercise that power? It seems like the biggest problem that we have is that when we put in the work to elect progressives, there's not a willingness to say, no, we're not going to go along with you just because you're Nancy Pelosi or you're Chuck Schumer.
Yeah, and, I think a lot of it boils down to that we need to increase the number of progressives, real corporate free progressives that are in power in Congress. Because even with the Congressional Progressive Caucus, you have a lot of members in there that will join the caucus to fend off a primary challenger, my opponent included. And these are people who are not real progressives, who are not putting the work to advocate for bold structural reforms, like eradicating homelessness, like single payer, like a Green New Deal, and so forth. They're simply there to avoid a primary challenger. And so I think we need some reforms within the caucus to make sure that any person who wants to join that caucus is truly a corporate-free progressive and is going to commit to being a bold advocate for a certain number of progressive priorities and policies. And so we need to deepen the bench. That's why our campaign has, again, taken a concerted effort to work with progressives running for U.S. Congress, like Jason Call in Washington State, like Michaela Wilkes, like Alexandra Hunt, like Nina Turner, like Jessica Mason, like Angelica Duenas running right next door to us here in CA 29, and others. Because we need to elect as many real progressives as possible to be able to actually wield that power. Because I kind of see both sides of this. Well, at the same time, I argue, yes, the progressives in power now need to be doing a lot more to leverage their power. I also recognize that they are a small minority in a sea of 535 corporate politicians. And so we need to increase the amount of elected progressives as well, so we can work collaboratively on wielding that power on behalf of the American people. And again, it goes back to being transparent with our voters about what the actual barriers are and really instituting policies based in real co-governance, so that our community is actually the stakeholders working with their elected officials on these policy changes. It has to be that way. That's the only way we're going to actually get more people involved in civic life, get people more engaged, and increase our power to actually get these things done.
Yeah, you mentioned some progressive champions there that are running for Congress. Jason Call actually happens to be in my district. I've interviewed him before. Fantastic. Running against Rick Larson, who's Larson's one of the most conservative Democrats in the House. If you look at the actual ratings that real politics do and those kinds of things, but we definitely need to deepen the bench. One thing that you and Jason, and I think Nina Turner, and I hope many others understand is, MMT tells us that we can deficit spend without it being this whole freaking catastrophe, and we don't need to fearmonger about debts and deficits and things like that. It seems to be very difficult to get the public to understand this to a level where it's politically okay to say that. John Yarmouth, budget chair, head of the budget, or chair of the budget committee rather, came out and pretty much acknowledged this and touted Stephanie Kelton's book and things like that. But how do you think we can get the public to better understand the monetary system so that we can make these arguments without sounding like we're irresponsible or reckless?
Yeah, it goes back to having honest and open conversations with our voters about the state of our economy and around the way the federal budget works. Because Stephanie Kelton talked about this, right? A lot of people are looking at this through the lens of a household and through the lens of state and local governments, where actually balancing the budget is a real concern, something that you have to do. Why? Because households, state, and local governments are currency users, not currency issuers. The federal government is the sole currency issuer. And one thing she talks about, which is brilliant, is, deficits always help somebody, right? When the Republicans passed a $2 trillion deficit finance tax cuts for the rich, 80% of those benefits automatically trickled to the top 1% of the income distribution. That was deficit spending. That's money in the hands of corporations and the wealthy, as opposed to deficit spending in a way that helps the 99%. Things like universal childcare, like canceling student debt, like tuition-free public college and university, like single payer, like a homes guarantee. We invest in that, we will see our economy boom, because we're putting more and more resources and dollars in the pockets of the American people to go out and increase their own economic livelihood and benefits and opportunities. That's where our priorities need to be. Not in the U.S. war machine, not in tax cuts for billionaires, not in corporate welfare, but in actually investing in the American people, the bottom 99%. So, it boils back to having these bold, honest conversations with the American people about what we need to do, and recognizing, again, that deficit spending always helps somebody. And when we talk about, how are you going to afford single payer? How are you going to afford a Green New Deal? How can we not afford it? In this moment, in the wealthiest nation in the world, how can we not afford it when we have over 554,000 unhoused neighbors across the entire country? Well, we have millions of kids living in poverty. Well, we have tens of millions without healthcare coverage. We have to prioritize the American people and stop prioritizing corporate welfare and the billionaire class.
Yeah, you know, we tend to talk about cost in financial terms instead of cost in human terms.
Right.
And like how many lives are negatively impacted by our unwillingness to address these scenarios? How many people literally just die? What is it? Something like 50,000 or so per year in this country die from lack of access, not to like some specialty care that only exists in a few places in the world, from lack of access to basic, just to simple basic healthcare. 50,000 people a year. I mean, that's like, just to put it into context in terms of how the media covers this kind of stuff, that's like 25 9/11s worth of deaths every year, but it doesn't get covered like that. It doesn't, one is sensationalized, the other is not. And I'm not obviously tragedy whenever I'm not, anyway, the point was to point out the hypocrisy in the media there. Right. And it seems like, there's this rather callous phrase in politics that I think is actually quite true. Never let a good tragedy go to waste. And it seems quite a bit like this pandemic, at least coming out of the New Deal, we learned a little bit that we embrace some Keynesian economics. We can spend a little bit to pull ourselves out of this. We can create jobs. Seems to me like what are we at? Almost 700,000 COVID deaths or something in that ballpark. The economic turmoil, the evictions that we're about to see, starting to happen this month. It seems like we're not learning anything from these tragedies. We're not coming out on the other side with more knowledge about how we can better serve our constituents. So how do we sort of message in a way that makes that land, you know what I mean, that connects the policy to the suffering that we've seen through this pandemic?
I would challenge that in the sense that I think the American people understand what we need. And the American people understand that this system is rigged and it is broken by design. I think what we fail to do is elect politicians who are going to actually put in the work to address these problems structurally and through a public health lens, meaning investing in prevention as opposed to always being reactionary. That's what the issue boils down to me for. Is, again, the people want these changes. We talked about, you threw out all these stats about over 80% want to see changes in terms of getting corporate money out of politics. Over 60% want single payer, and so on and so forth. Everyone wants living wages. The American people want these things. But the problem is that we have so many politicians that are really good at schmoozing without actually putting in the work. And so that's why, again, it goes back to education and honest conversations in our communities about the issues, calling a spade, and calling out politicians who want to virtue signal, like Brad Sherman, without advocating for these bold. I'm going to keep saying it over and over again like a broken record because it's the truth. We deserve advocates, not co-sponsors. All that goes into co-sponsoring a bill is sending a one-sentence email to the bill sponsor saying, please add my boss's name. You didn't have to help write it. You didn't have to offer an amendment. You didn't have to give your opinion. But again, you get to add your name and go back and give lip service. Enough performative politics. That is a cancer in our society.
Yeah, that I absolutely. What is the response been? This is somewhat anecdotal, but what kind of response has your campaign gotten to that kind of messaging? Like, are voters in your district under the misimpression that Sherman is a progressive? Are they open-minded to critiques? Are they like, what is their impression of Congress and of their representative? Have they been fooled by his, or what are you in from your constituents?
People are ready to oust him. I mean, there is a growing progressive zeal in our district. Like I said, we are D+18 in a district that Bernie Sanders won with 44,000 votes. I can count on, we have spoken to over 11,000 voters this far. I can count on one hand how many people are impressed by or happy with Brad Sherman. Everyone else wants to elect a real progressive because they're tired. And they recognize that our district needs a bold advocate. And they recognize when it comes to the climate, when it comes to public transit, when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to abolition of our criminal injustice system, divesting from the U.S. war machine, Brad is not the leader that we need him to be. He is not the representative that we need him to be. And so we are incredibly grateful for the outpouring of support we've seen from voters in our district, where we now have over 150 volunteers signed up, 70% of whom live in our district and are under the age of 30. Where we're proud to have the endorsement of local advocacy groups like the West Valley People's Alliance and Democratic clubs like the Feel the Burn Democratic Club. At the national level from organizations like Brand New Congress. And, we have outraised all prior primary challengers in our district combined. We still got a 3 million corporate war chest to contend with. So we're still raising more money. We're still bringing in more volunteers, but we have 484,000 voters to reach. And so we are investing heavily in our field program, meeting our community members where they're at, and highlighting the policies and issues they care about. And what we're seeing is a lot of people are fed up with Brad Sherman, and they want to see bold, progressive change. And so we're building the plane, as they say, and we are incredibly grateful for all the support we have so far. And we are very confident we're going to win in 2022 because it's the issues and priorities and policies we are centering in our campaign. And that's what people want to see.
That's exactly what people want to see. If you want to win somebody over, stop with the theater and give people what they need. Can you just speak briefly to, we've talked a lot about how like to me, electoral politics is just a small part of what we need to do politically. A lot of it's activism and organizing and keeping the pressure on and that kind of stuff. Can you talk about how that community building element is really like a key backbone for our movement and not just doing the let's elect one more, you know what I mean? Like there has to be that kind of substantive backbone of the community building and the organizing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I keep talking about co-governance, right? Because that means that the community stakeholders are the ones that are informing and directing those policy changes. And so we've been we made it very intentional to work with our community on designing our policies, on getting feedback on our policies, and working with our community on mutual aid projects. One project that we launched alongside the Valley Justice Coalition, a progressive group here in our community, is to be able to raise money to purchase harm reduction supplies for our unhoused neighbors. Because one thing we've seen during the COVID-19 pandemic is a huge increase in opioid overdose deaths among our unhoused neighbors as a result of lack of access to healthcare resources, physical and social isolation, further criminalization. All these things are perpetuating the trauma that our folks living on the streets are experiencing. And so we're seeing increases in overdose deaths. And because the city has not stepped in to provide this need, our campaign made an initial purchase of over $5,500 worth of naloxone to revive folks who have experienced an opioid overdose, and to purchase other harm reduction supplies and raise more money to continue doing that. So mutual aid is embedded within our campaign because we recognize that our community needs have to be addressed now. We cannot just wait until we have, to your point, Luke, progressives that are elected to get these things done. People are hurting now. We need to provide relief now. In addition to that, our campaign has been engaging in mutual aid efforts every Sunday, going out with the community, and handing out food, cold water, tents, tarps, harm reduction supplies every single Sunday to our unhoused neighbors. We have over 8,000 unhoused neighbors in our district, over 44,000 within the city of Los Angeles. We are ground zero for our homelessness crisis. We have 5 unhoused neighbors die per day. And so, again, we cannot wait until progressives are elected to Congress to get these things done. We got to stop the bleeding now and meet our community where they're at now. And that's what our campaign is dedicated to doing.
This might end up being a little bit repetitive with what we've been talking about, but can you just, how does that happen in one of the most progressive cities? Like, how, you know what I mean? How is LA leading, or one of the leading cities in the homelessness crisis, when it is such a progressive voter base? Again, I don't mean to be repetitive here, but that just is so astonishing to me. How does that become the case?
I mean, we have some pretty draconian laws in the books here in California and here in the city of Los Angeles. And California has a pretty dark history, especially when it comes to institutional racism and redlining. When you look at cities like LA and the San Fernando Valley in particular, the reason why so much of the area is zoned for single family homes is because of redlining and because the valley was established as a rich white enclave for decades. As the federal government denied mortgages to Black and brown communities. And we saw incredibly racist policies like freeway expansions that were directly through Black and brown neighborhoods, forcibly displacing them to build those freeways. And so to this day now, where we see local communities of color, we have less canopy coverage, we have less public transit, we have higher rates of food insecurity, we have lower rates of affordable housing, and we have lower housing costs as well. And so for all these, and as a result, less financing of education as well, since education funding is tied to property taxes. And so higher income neighborhoods have more education resources than low income neighborhoods. And so just because a city like LA has a lot of progressive residents does not mean that our politicians are progressive. And I think, again, the people are waking up to this, which is why that there are a lot of amazing progressives running for city council here in LA, running for city controller, running for state assembly. And so, again, we need to build that solidarity, build that camaraderie among progressives up and down the ballot so we can actually work together to see these structural policy reforms enacted. Like I said just earlier, just last week, I joined organizers outside of City Hall who are protesting passage of 4118, a measure that will criminalize our unhoused community members and violate their basic constitutional rights against cruel and unusual punishment. It's disgraceful. And the way the city designed this ordinance, despite all these court settlements in the 9th District, which LA is a part of, to be able to avoid any questions of constitutionality, it's disgraceful. And people are suffering under these draconian austerity measures. We need to invest in our basic human rights. We need to make a housing a human right and enact the policies to make it so. That means including our unhoused neighbors as a federally protected class, banning criminalization of homelessness, repealing the over 20-year ban on federal financing of public housing, and fully funding our public housing and voucher programs as an entitlement. These are basic changes we have to make at the federal level to preempt these kinds of criminalized policies here at the local level.
Yeah, that's really something else. I mean, it's not like we're not talking about a judge being cornered by the way that something's written. We're talking about politicians going out of their way to make sure that something's written in a way that is just, to me, what is your incentive there? Is you really just hate the homeless that much? I mean, I really genuinely, that is stunning to me. That's like a visceral. That's insane. And as you know, I'm from the Seattle area. I can somewhat relate. We do have a couple of open socialists on our city council, but largely the Democrats in Seattle are pretty corporate friendly, even though we're supposed to be one of the most progressive cities in the country. And we also have a tremendous problem with gentrification and homelessness.
Right.
See a lot of parallels there. Well, Shervin, I have your website up there down at the bottom of the screen. What can people do if they want to learn more about you or get involved with your campaign? Where are you guys at as a campaign right now?
Yeah, so ShervinForTheValley.com. You can learn our in-depth policy platform, sign up to volunteer, donate to our People First campaign. Our campaign proudly accepts zero corporate PAC money, zero lobbyist money. We've taken the no fossil fuel money pledge, the no cop money pledge, the homes guarantee pledge, the Code Pink pledge to divest from the U.S. war machine, and much more. So we are 100% financed by progressive donors, and all of that money is going into building a strong field campaign to pay all of our organizers living wages to go out in the community, door knock for us, phone bank for us, text bank for us, so we can oust a corporate politician and elect a real progressive. Please sign up to volunteer. Please donate. Please spread the word. Let's oust a 24-year entrenched corporate politician, elect a real progressive. Thank you all so much.
Well, I tell you, if I was Mr. Sherman, I'd be shaking in my boots. So we'll definitely keep up with your campaign, Shervin. Thank you so much for taking the time today, and I hope we can do this again sometime.
Thanks again, Luke. Thanks again to your viewers. Take care. Appreciate having me on.
Yeah, talk to you soon. Bye. That was a fantastic segment there. Huge thanks to Shervin for taking the time. That's the exact kind of discussions that we need to be having with our progressive candidates and with activists and things around the country. We need to turn talk into action, and it's promising to see some progressive candidates who are fighting for real substantive change. He mentioned Jason Call and Nina Turner and others. Shervin certainly in that category. So here's to hoping that we can take over some more seats in the House and in the Senate going forward, and that we can actually use that power to affect progressive changes that we desperately need. Unbelievable to hear about the houseless population there in LA. It's always astonishing and somewhat viscerally stunning to me that these progressive cities are so neglectful in so many different areas. as I mentioned, I'm from the Seattle area, and we see a lot of parallels there. It's one of those that's I say a lot. Things are often predictable from an intellectual sense if you follow politics closely enough, but at the same time, sort of emotionally stunning, right? Is seeing the over 500,000 homeless in this country. That's viscerally stunning, even if you can say that, following the neoliberal era, it's kind of predictable. We're in this horrendous state of politics where these just disastrous atrocities are quite predictable and easy to see coming, unfortunately. So have an interesting story here for you guys. I don't often talk about, Trump or any of Trump's cronies, but this is about Jared Kushner, who's obviously Trump's son-in-law and was actually quite a prominent part of his White House, his administration. And this story just really kind of tells a tale that's all too common in Washington about the revolving door and about proximity to power, being used to rapacious and greedy ends. This is in the Independent here. Going back to his previous job of being born wealthy, critics pounce on news Jared Kushner is leaving politics to launch an investment firm. I am shocked to learn that Jared Kushner cannot find a job in politics anywhere, one Twitter user writes mockingly. Jared Kushner, former President Donald Trump's top advisor and son-in-law, is leaving politics to launch an investment firm, reporters say. Sources familiar with Mr. Kushner's plan said on Wednesday that the launch of the firm will take place in the next few months and remove Mr. Kushner from the political fray for the foreseeable future. So the details of this, you guys, it's an investment firm in Miami that he's going to be basically using to broker deals between Americans and others in countries where he had done work for the Trump administration. So he had worked in the Middle East and brokered a deal basically between Israel and some of the Arab states surrounding Israel. Now, Dr. Trita Parsi, who does fantastic work on foreign policy and Iran policy and these kinds of things, basically said that there was already an agreement that was sort of not public or explicit, and all that Kushner did was make it public or explicit. So I'm not trying to say that Kushner did a whole lot, but the point is he had contacts in this region because he did this work for the Trump administration. Now he's going to use those contacts for his own financial gain with this investment firm. And it's also worth noting that this is a prime example of the revolving door and how proximity to power is so beneficial in Washington, D.C. and in United States politics. It's entirely possible that Trump is going to run again. I can see both sides of that argument. I part of me really thinks he's just putting on a show to keep himself relevant. But all the reports were that he didn't really particularly like being president outside of all of the attention. He didn't like that it's a hard job and that there are a lot of things you actually have to take care of and difficult decisions to make and things like that. He basically wants to play golf and watch Fox News and eat his Big Macs. So I am kind of speculating that he's going to let this linger until the last minute so that his name stays in the news and he stays relevant. But I think he likes getting to stay down at Mar-a-Lago and then call down Kevin McCarthy or whoever and basically direct them to do what he wants. I think he likes this setup where it takes a lot less work. But in either case, the point is, if there's even speculation that Donald Trump is going to run again, Kushner gets to use that as proximity to power, right? Where people will now invest in this firm simply to have influence over somebody who might be close to a future president or close to somebody who has such influence over one of the major parties. So this is how the revolving door works. This is how corruption or soft corruption often works. Even though it's brazen, it's kind of this soft version where you can't say there's a direct quid pro quo, right? This is how DC operates, you guys. Proximity to power, revolving door, etc. And this was a prime example that I wanted to make sure to bring to you all. Jared and Ivanka, obviously, just absolutely horrendous actors. And out for their own self-interest, and very much open to criticism. I want to note, I tend to leave the families of politicians alone for the most part, but when you're an advisor, when you are doing work, foreign policy work on behalf of the administration, you are opening yourself up to criticism. So to all of those who say, you got to leave Ivanka alone, go after Donald, I think that's nonsense. She inserted herself into the political arena, and she is very worthy of criticism, as is Jared. and their participation here in corruption is worth noting. We've covered a little bit previously the Andrew Cuomo story. Andrew Cuomo, there's actually like a handful of stories. He's just a really bad dude. Sexual assault allegations, harassment allegations, all sorts of things in that department, as well as his undercounting nursing home deaths, or underreporting rather nursing home deaths during the COVID pandemic. His mishandling of that pandemic, even going into it. Shervin there was talking a little bit about how we don't act to prevent these catastrophes ahead of time. Cuomo, a prime example of this, he had made cuts to public health funding in the state of New York. So a number of clinics and hospitals had been closed right before the pandemic during Cuomo's term, and the infrastructure in place in the state's Medicaid program also had been diminished, leading to a much more difficult environment to deal with the COVID pandemic. And I just want to take a very quick second to note, we talk a lot at Real Progressives about the race to the bottom. This is an area where federal funding would very much mitigate a lot of these issues. If the state didn't have to worry about their budget, and they are financially constrained, they do have to work on a budget, there would not be a concern about spending in terms of cutting one program to fund another, right? So this is why a robust Medicare for All system, or more ideally, a robust NHS, would solve a lot of problems and would free states up to deal with other issues that currently go underfunded and underaddressed, many of which I was just talking about with Shervin. But that's just a little bit of a side note here. This is a story about Cuomo's. There was an investigation from the Department of Justice. There's actually, again, a number of investigations into Andrew Cuomo. One of them came from the Department of Justice. And to be really clear, you guys, both Trump and Biden have been incredibly political in how they've gone about this. So the Trump administration only investigated Democratic governors for gross negligence during the COVID pandemic. They investigated Cuomo, they investigated Whitmer, New Jersey, and one other state, I believe, but they were all Democratic governors that the Trump administration, decided to investigate for this. And now Biden is all too happy to investigate DeSantis, not so happy to investigate Cuomo. It appears very, very political, even though all of these governors of both parties are quite guilty of gross negligence during the COVID pandemic. Well, now we're getting news that the Department of Justice will not be going forward with that investigation against Andrew Cuomo. Surprise, surprise, the Biden administration deciding not to go forward, criticizing their own. Department of Justice, this is in WSHU.org. Department of Justice says no probe into state-run nursing homes in New York. The Justice Department has decided not to open a civil rights investigation into government-run nursing homes in New York over their COVID-19 response, according to a letter sent Friday to several Republican members of Congress. Under former President Donald Trump's administration, the department's Civil Rights Division requested data last August from 4 states, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania was the other one, and Michigan, about the number of COVID-19 infections and deaths in public nursing homes. The request came amid still unanswered questions about whether some states, especially New York, inadvertently worsened the pandemic death toll by requiring nursing homes to accept residents previously hospitalized for COVID-19. In a letter sent to several Republicans who had demanded an investigation, Deputy Assistant Attorney General Joe Gaeta said Civil Rights Division lawyers had reviewed the data sent by New York along with additional information. Quote, based on that review, we have decided not to open a CRIPA investigation of any public nursing facility within New York at this time, Gaeta wrote, referring to the Federal Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act, which empowers the Justice Department to investigate allegations about unlawful conditions in government-run residence. There's even more to this, you guys. There are discrepancies between the federal government's death toll in New York, overall death toll, not just nursing homes, and Cuomo's administration's count, and it's a wide discrepancy. I might have these numbers slightly off, but you'll get the idea. It is something like the state of New York claims 43,000 COVID deaths, and the CDC claims 53,000 COVID deaths in New York. It's something like 10,000 deaths that they are apart in their count. So it would very much appear to me, and I don't know this, legal caveat for Cuomo's lawyers, I do not know. It would very much appear to me that they're continuing to undercount deaths and continuing to attempt to make Cuomo look good here, and making it all the more nauseating and all the more hypocritical and revolting is the fact that that Cuomo put out a self-aggrandizing book about how he had handled the COVID situation and how to go about leadership and this and that, right? Talking himself up and praising himself. Well, some of his aides were helping him write this book, which is already a very questionable thing because those aides are being paid by the state, and now they're being asked to help write a book that Cuomo was going to, not, but the profits are not going to the state of New York. Okay, so that already is quite iffy. But even worse, the very aides who were helping him write this fucking book were also, participating in the manipulation of deaths being reported from nursing homes. So while they are covering up how poorly Cuomo handled the pandemic, they're helping him write a book where he brags about how great he was at handling the pandemic and what a fantastic leader he is. Cuomo is one of the most narcissistic people in politics. He's quite Trumpian in how he responds to things. If you've ever seen Andrew Cuomo pressed at a press conference, the second he gets the tiniest little bit of pushback, he snaps. He's clearly got quite a temper. He's clearly quite controlling. He's clearly narcissistic and self-interested. Really does not come off as a good dude. And there's also a number of sexual harassment allegations, not just against Cuomo, but against like the culture that he sets up in his administration. So not just him personally harassing people, but also him kind of setting up a culture that allows for that and that does not punish people for that, right? Lindsey Boylan says that Andrew Cuomo sexually assaulted her. So it's not even just harassment. There are assault allegations against Andrew Cuomo. I mean, it's the guy still holds his seat, and that the Democrats in the state have just let all of this go and fall by the wayside. That the Biden administration is going to play politics here and essentially ignore this because he has a D next to his name. It's egregious. It's disgusting. It's revolting. It's what people cannot stand about politics. And again, the flip side was true about Trump. He ignored DeSantis's gross negligence down in Florida. He ignored Abbott's gross negligence in Texas, right? So he goes after 4 blue governors and ignores the red governors. Well, what's Biden going to do now? He's going to not go after Andrew Cuomo or Gretchen Whitmer because they are on his quote unquote team. They're wearing blue jerseys, so it's okay that they caused like thousands of COVID deaths, right? Notice the difference in messaging based upon who is perceived to be at fault or who can be blamed for the situation. Andrew Cuomo should resign or he should be impeached. And unfortunately, it's looking more and more likely like neither of those is going to happen. I believe he is up in 2022. I might have that wrong, but I believe he's up in 2022. We'll see if he decides to run again. All of the rumors are that he is going to try to run again. So we'll see if that affects his ability to do so. A number of, New York has quite a political machine and quite a deep bench of Democrats. So we'll see if someone decides to primary him and if they are effective in doing so. But Cuomo still does appear to have the backing of the establishment in the state, unfortunately. And again, just quite an indictment on the Democratic Party, quite an indictment on our political processes and our making everything political, are partisanizing everything, if you will. I don't even know if that's a word, partisanizing. No idea. I just made it up. It's a word now. But in any case, Andrew Cuomo here going to get off scot-free for his gross negligence, which caused thousands of deaths in nursing homes in the state of New York. It's really, really sad. It's really disgusting. Think about that, you guys. Like if that was your loved one who had years taken off of their life because of his gross negligence. And then he writes a book where he brags about how he handled this thing. And then the Department of Justice drops their investigation into his gross negligence. How would you feel? This is just beyond egregious. And again, there's a clear partisan distinction in how the media actually goes about covering these things. So speaking of partisanship and bipartisanship, we were talking a little bit earlier about, the sort of cosplaying bipartisanship. I think I've said that term 4 or 5 times this stream, you guys. I just love that term. Brianna Joy Gray, brilliant one. This is a story, again, about the military-industrial complex. We mentioned earlier how we are selling I believe it was 25 no, that's the number here, 25 billion increase to the Pentagon. Biden sold a whole bunch of helicopters made by Lockheed Martin to Israel, right? Continuing to increase profits of the top defense contractors at the cost of Palestinian lives. This is a pattern around the world. This is a story here in Politico. Senate panel backs $25 billion Pentagon budget boost. The proposed increase is a bipartisan blow to President Joe Biden's spending plans. The Senate Armed Services Committee has voted to boost the budget top line of the National Defense Authorization Act by $25 billion during its closed-door markup, a bipartisan rebuke of President Joe Biden's $715 billion blueprint. The vote drew support from Democrats after Republican senators telegraphed in recent weeks that they would seek to boost the overall defense budget. The vote was announced Thursday by Senator Tim Kaine, a member of the Armed Services Committee, in a call with reporters. The proposed increase is a bipartisan blow to Biden's spending plans, as well as to advocates who sought to curb historically high levels of defense spending. The increase could shake up budget talks significantly, with House Democrats already endorsing Biden's $715 billion level for the base Pentagon budget in their annual defense spending bill. While the base Pentagon budget request is for $715 billion, the entire proposal, which includes Department of Energy funding for nuclear activities, comes out to $753 billion. The fiscal 2021 enacted budget was $741 billion in total, with $704 billion for the Pentagon. Despite the increase from last year, GOP defense hawks have assailed Biden's proposed budget for not keeping up with inflation. Ridiculous, by the way, just a little side. That's absolutely ridiculous commentary. But the point is, you guys, I'm going to draw a comparison here to what happened under Donald Trump, where Nancy Pelosi and Democrats provided significantly more spending to the military, to the Pentagon, to the Department of Defense than Donald Trump requested. Okay, now they're doing the same thing to Biden. So this is one of the areas where bipartisanship is awful. It almost always is, you guys. Like, I'm not going to say it always is. There could theoretically be a bipartisan bill that's great. But if you actually look at the examples of bipartisanship, where is there unanimous, approval in Washington, D.C.? It's over the endless wars and the military industrial complex and serving corporations with corporate welfare and deregulating banks and, the areas where we find bipartisan consensus are often in the very worst areas for the people of this country and for the people around the world. And this very much one of those examples. No matter who is president, Congress always wants to give them more and more and more and more military spending. And this despite the fact that Biden is, at least rhetorically, saying that he wants to back out of a lot of these conflicts, or at least reduce our the number of troops and things on the ground in a number of these conflicts. Now, I want to be clear, and when I covered Biden saying he was going to pull out of Afghanistan, I was clear that there is no reason to necessarily believe that he's actually going to pull all the way out. It does appear he has taken quite a few troops out of Afghanistan. But just a couple of days ago, I was reading an article that we are bombing in Afghanistan again. So he, again, as Shervin was talking about there, gets to get the media headlines by saying he's backing out. And he even received quite a bit of media pushback. Again, just like Congress, the mainstream media absolutely unanimous in its support for the military-industrial complex, no questions asked ever. But despite that rhetoric, he then turns around and continues to bomb Afghanistan. But I bring all of this up to point out that even though he is rhetorically saying we need to back out of a lot of these conflicts, or we need to reduce our influence in these countries, what does Congress do? Take more money, please take more money. What does Congress do when we want to spend on a progressive policy agenda item? They say, where are you going to get the money for it? How are you going to afford it? What are the pay-fors, right? This is why we talk so much about MMT, you guys, because that excuse does not fly if the populace actually understands how monetary systems operate. And Congress very clearly understands this, because look at how they handle the military. When they want to add $25 billion to the military budget, do you think they go say, well, we better increase taxes? No. Does a single reporter in the mainstream media say, hey, how are you going to pay for it? Where are you getting the money for that? Like, they endlessly, just battered Bernie with these questions. How are you going to pay for it? Your estimates are off according to so-and-so. Just endlessly pop, 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 right? Over and over again. It's all Bernie seemed to hear when he would bring up the healthcare his healthcare proposal, his single payer proposal. But when it comes to $25 billion being added to the already inflated and bloated military budget, do we hear word one about the funding mechanisms? Of course we don't. The hypocrisy is rank, and it's right plain in front of you. It's very clear. And this is one of the areas that needs to be addressed immediately, is that we cause or contribute to all of this suffering and death around the world. We are allied with a strong majority of the world's dictatorships. We continue to support Israel's ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. We continue to support the Saudis' genocide of Yemeni populations. We continue to inflict inhumane and barbaric sanctions on countries like Iran, like Venezuela, like Cuba, which disallow them from getting medical equipment, and food and things like this. We work with the Saudis to manipulate oil markets so that Venezuela's economy will crash, and then we point at it and say, see what socialism does, right? This is our influence on the world stage, and a lot of it is rooted in these top military contractors like Lockheed Martin, like Raytheon, like Boeing, etc., getting to maintain these contracts. And that is an indictment of proportions that are hard to describe. That's one of the few bipartisan areas or areas of bipartisan agreement in our politics, is quite an indictment on our culture and on our political system and these kinds of things, right? The detachment between Washington consensus and the voters consensus tells you just how little the democratic pressures in our system actually work, unfortunately. I'm very hopeful that Shervin is correct, that if we continue to increase numbers, that we will achieve more power and perhaps embolden some of the people who will at least rhetorically take the correct position on a lot of these issues. But just beyond egregious stuff, you guys. It's just beyond outrageous. So I want to talk a little bit about how there have been a number of strikes lately, and the mainstream media has essentially entirely neglected to cover them at all. We did a video on the strikes in Lima, Ohio. Go check that out. It's on the Real Progress in Action, YouTube channel. We covered the protest there in Lima, Ohio. But there have also been other protests, or I'm sorry, not protests, strike. The strike in Lima, Ohio. There are also strikes going on around the country. I talked a little bit about the Frito-Lay situation either last week or the week before. We're going to go ahead and watch a video here. This is from More Perfect Union. This is about that Frito-Lay situation. This is an update talking about one specific worker who his name's Brandon Ingram, not the basketball star, one of the workers at a Frito-Lay plant, and he tells a pretty devastating story about a workplace injury and how the company responded. So let's take a watch. This is More Perfect Union. If you don't follow them on Twitter, I really encourage you to. They do quite a bit of great reporting on labor issues and worker mistreatment and these kinds of things. So we'll watch this clip, come back and discuss.
Stalking us, recording my kids playing in the yard.
I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy.
I tried to hold it in, I'm sorry.
So I got the job at Frito-Lay in January of 2011. Prior to Frito-Lay, I was in the United States Navy.
Leaving the service, he just needed to matter. He needed to belong and have a purpose. We both thought he found that in Frito-Lay, and so we kind of centered our life around it.
I worked hard. I bust my butt every day, in and out. Shit, my wife was gonna divorce me because she didn't even think I was at work for real.
No, I did not believe my husband just spent 20 hours at work. No one would believe that. He's not a doctor. It's chips. It's chips and dip.
I went on a stretch one time of like 26 days in a row. Was using a dock door. You press the button and it automatically does what it's supposed to do. I got electrocuted. I was taken to the ER, but the emergency room they took me to was 45 minutes away. We passed 4 hospitals on the way to the hospital they wanted to take me to. And the reason that is because they signed a contract with a certain hospital and a certain network.
From the very next day after the accident, my husband was never the same. He was working really hard to even just get up on to the side of the bed. Usually he's like hops out of bed and he hurries up, puts his clothes on, and he shoves food down his throat and he's out the door, you know, in 30 minutes. He was used to it. He was trained to do that in the service.
When I say I was healthy as an ox, I was healthy as an ox.
We just didn't have any answers. They said he should have been fine, but he wasn't.
I didn't get any time off after the incident. I had to call off the next day as a sick day. I told you I was in pain. I told you it hurts when I walk. And it was like, okay, you know, are you gonna be here tomorrow? I was a site lead and I know what that entails. You're a leadership of the whole warehouse. So if you have to fill in, you have to fill in. I asked for some type of relief, period, because I was still obligated to work, like picking cases and unloading trucks or rotating product on a forklift. I asked for a chair that I could sit in that would make me more comfortable while I'm doing my office work. They denied it. You're either 100% or you can't work. It just felt like they was just trying to push me out. Eventually I got an MRI by my primary doctor, and he showed that I had 2 herniated discs in my back. And he was like, you shouldn't be doing anything. They could only fix it with surgery.
And my husband still had to work this whole entire time.
They had to remove 2 of the discs in my neck because they were bulging into my spinal cord. I wasn't getting enough fluid to my brain. If I didn't have the surgery, the doctor said any small fall or accident or something like that, and I would have been paralyzed from the neck down or dead. I still have to have surgery on my lower lumbar spine.
From the moment that he couldn't work anymore and needed short-term disability, Frito-Lay abandoned us.
I had to file for short-term disability and then long-term disability. Got approved for long-term disability, but that was months later. So no income coming in.
That's a picture of the car. We were driving.
They require you to go to the doctor so many times, and the doctor has to say that you're in this condition over and over and over. But guess what? You don't have any insurance anymore through PepsiCo/Frito-Lay because they cut you off. I had to pay for that out of pocket too. Didn't have the money to do that. So guess what? I borrowed money or used credit cards or whatever I could. I even took money out my kids' piggy bank.
We had to take from our children to live.
And the doctor knew what was going on. So he was like, look, just pay half of what you owe every visit, and we'll just take care of the rest later. I never wanted to have a lawsuit, just not me. But I did ask for help, and I wasn't getting it.
Frito-Lay, Pepsi, Sedgwick, whoever has people following my family. They are stalking us.
Just to find something to be like, oh, he's okay.
Recording my kids playing in the yard, recording me doing yard work. They follow me in traffic, on the highway, on streets. They followed me when I gave birth to my baby. They followed me to my daughter's school. I took my daughter out of school and decided to homeschool because I don't know if we're safe. I don't know how many people they've given our address and name and information to just to prove my husband wrong. They've done it for years.
Why are you fighting so hard to say that I'm not hurt instead of just look at the paperwork, look at the medical stuff, look at everything I've been through? You would think that I'm a bad employee the way that everything has went. I've never done anything wrong to this company or even with this company. I have numerous awards to show that I'm not a person that you just throw away I knew the sales side, I knew the operation side. I mean, hell, you could have just let me be a lead and just manage instead of physically working.
Billion-dollar corporations like Pepsi, which owns Frito-Lay, they know this is happening to people, and they do nothing about it. My husband shouldn't have to fight for 5 years over something that took less than 5 minutes to impact our entire life. He pushed a button at work, a button he can't avoid pushing. He has to push it, it's his job.
For a company that talks about diversity and culture and a family-oriented business, family don't just throw you out because you get injured.
The company makes over $200 billion a year, okay? It's chips. But my husband is worth $0 to them because he's no longer able to push those chips.
You are a number. You're a piece of property. I bust my butt for them. Blood, sweat, tears, sacrifices, holidays, birthdays. I miss so much family things because they make you feel like if you don't do what they say, they will let you go.
I don't even know where to go from here. Honestly, all the life goals and marriage goals and family goals that we had are gone, and I just have to figure out how to survive. And my goal and hopes and dreams now is for my husband to get back healthy and still be alive with us in the future. He dodged bullets in the city of St. Louis growing up. He dodged gangs. He stayed out of all of that. He went to war. He dodged bullets and bombs and came back to me. And now he's been electrocuted at work. We don't know what's going to happen from day to day. My husband stops breathing at night in his sleep. I have to wake him up at night to make sure he keeps breathing. I have to help with my children who don't understand they can't jump and play with daddy.
I mean, I just went from a very fit guy to a guy who is disabled and can barely just handle regular life stuff. I'm 36. I should be able to play with my kids in the yard. I just want my life back.
I don't even know, like, what the fuck do I say to that, you guys? That's I'm not somebody who is my emotional response to things is not typically to cry. I was fighting it a little bit watching that. That's you know, what do I say? What do I say to that? Unfettered capitalism. Meanwhile, though, the company gets every built-in benefit in the book, right? It's unfettered capitalism for the poor while we give socialism to the rich, effectively. I mean, that's a slight oversimplification, but it's really true. Anytime that a big company like Pepsi needs something, they can go to the federal government and get bailed out or get deregulation or get a tax break or whatever the fuck they want. When Brandon Ingram gives up his life in his mid-30s, effectively loses his quality of life or significantly diminishes his quality of life for the company he's working for a company that is already exploiting him, that is already stealing his labor. And then he even tries to handle it in a way that's not vindictive towards that company. And what do? They surveil him to try to disprove that he's actually hurt. They refuse to cover costs. They try to weasel their way out of having to pay for something that happened at work. What do you even say to that? Again, want to encourage everybody to watch our coverage of the strikes in Ohio. Thank you to Jules, who put in the comments, it's Lima. I mispronounced it. It's not Peru. Lima, Ohio, where those strikes took place. But this is another very important strike, in addition to what we're going to get into in a second, which is the coal miner strike in Alabama. But I wanted to make sure to bring you guys that clip because that's just absolutely devastating. Also, just want to take a quick moment to once again plug the new Untouchables, you guys. That kind of story, it's a very similar type of content that we bring with the new Untouchables, where we tell the stories of how these various versions of corruption affect everyday people and have a negative impact on their lives. That is just, you guys, when we had to take from our children's piggy bank to pay for medical costs because first of all, our society is so barbaric that we don't provide healthcare as a human right, and second of all, because the company that Brandon works for is so barbaric that they refused to take care of a situation like that when Brandon had given so much to that company. And you know, $200 billion a year that they make, they couldn't just pay for the medical costs. Instead, they choose. And I also want to note this. It cannot have costed all that much less. If I would guess it costs more to surveil them for, I think she said years, even if it's just months. That's not cheap, you guys. Private investigators are not cheap. Why didn't you just pay for the fucking healthcare? Well, the reason is that would set the precedent. That would mean that they then always have to do that. So they fight tooth and nail to not even give you an inch when a situation like this happens. And it's exactly what capitalism does to a society. We deem labor to be a cost instead of something that is actually helping that company, that is necessary for that company to thrive. The exploitation is the other way, right? The exploitation is the companies exploiting their workers and stealing their labor for excess profit value. Absolutely devastating story there, you guys. Just absolutely devastating. We have another strike to discuss here. This is in Common Dreams, and this has gotten almost no attention from the mainstream media. And I also want to confess, I am guilty of not covering this. I didn't even know this was freaking happening until recently. This has apparently been going on for months. So apologies. I would have covered this a lot earlier. This is an indictment again on our press that I didn't see a single story about this until recently, but it's been going on for months. Alabama miners take strike to BlackRock's New York City headquarters. All we want is a fair contract, said one striking miner. We don't want no more than what's owed to us. Chanting Warrior Met has no soul. Warrior Met, by the way, is the company in question here. Chanting Warrior Met has no soul, no contract, no coal. Over 1,000 United Mine Workers of America members and their allies picketed outside multinational asset management firm BlackRock's headquarters in New York City Wednesday to demand better pay and benefits. Miners and labor activists from states including New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, South Dakota, and West Virginia joined the picket lines in a show of solidarity with UMWA workers at Alabama's Brookwood Mine, operated by Warrior Met Coal, of which BlackRock is the largest shareholder. The Alabama miners have been on strike for over 4 months as they seek a new collective bargaining agreement with Warrior Met. And I just want to note, you guys, they're not even asking for a whole lot. They're just asking to go back to what the situation that they had, the compensation that they had before Warrior Met took this mine over. So Warrior Met came in and screwed over the workers, made their situation worse. And now these workers are striking just to go back to what they had, which was already inadequate. Okay. Really insane stuff here. And I also want to address, you guys, because I know this can get to be a little bit of a tricky issue. I think one of the reasons that this has not gotten the attention that I wish it would have gotten is because they're coal workers. And look, I don't want us investing in coal. If I had my way, we would provide green jobs to these people. We would use deficit spending to start a Green New Deal and a federal jobs guarantee where these people could work in actually improving our infrastructure and making our energy grid more green. So I am not pro-coal. What I am is pro-human and pro-worker. So when these individuals strike against a company that is taking advantage of them, the issue at hand is not the coal itself or the environmental impact of the coal. The issue at hand is, do these workers deserve dignity and a decent compensation package and decent working conditions, or do they not? I think they do. Okay? Two separate discussions. If we want to talk climate, I'm 100% with everybody that says we need to get out of the business of coal. And we need to incentivize that in every possible way that we can. And we need to invest using the power of the purse to start to clean up our energy grid. But this is about workers who are being exploited by big companies and sacrificing themselves, their time, their families, their health for that company's profit and bottom line. And all that they're asking for, again, is just to go back to the situation that they had previously. They're not even asking for any more than that, yet this strike gets no coverage whatsoever. So unfortunately, I think they've kind of found themselves in a sweet spot where the left hesitates to talk about this because it's coal, and the right doesn't want to talk about it because they're workers on strike demanding better compensation and better treatment. They've almost kind of found like a niche that's between the two sides of the culture war, if you will. But I think it's very important to discuss these nuanced issues and to always stand in solidarity with workers everywhere. So, again, I would rather they have a green job, and if I were in charge, I would provide that job using the power of the purse. But as the situation stands, if we're going to continue to be mining coal, I certainly want the workers compensated and not treated like shit, not left to deal with the health problems from their work on their own dime, not left to be exploited to an even larger degree from these massive companies and massive investment firms who back these giant companies. So that's another strike that has gotten almost no attention. We're up to 2 already, Frito-Lay and the coal workers. And I have one more to bring you guys. There's actually a hunger strike going on in New York right now. Undocumented immigrants have been left out of the stimulus packages, or however you would term it, that the state has provided to people, right? So we're basically leaving people out of the necessary policies for survival during an economic crash and a pandemic. I have a short video here. This is once again from More Perfect Union. Again, they really do fantastic work, you guys. If you don't follow them, I really encourage you to. Here's a short video about the hunger strike going on in New York right now.
Mi nombre es Ana Ramírez y estoy aquí en 14 días de huelga de hambre.
For me, it's day 6 on hunger strike.
Nunca yo he tenido 4 días, 5 días sin comer.
I'm on day 13 in solidarity with the hunger strike with excluded workers.
Yo estoy en una huelga de hambre, pero técnicamente empecé la huelga de hambre cuando perdí mi trabajo.
The folks that are on hunger strike are largely undocumented. They're all people who have been left out of unemployment benefits and state and government aid in general during the pandemic.
Estamos aquí vendedores ambulantes, hombres de construcción, mujeres que limpian casa, de diferentes clases y tipos de trabajos aquí, el cual fuimos excluidos únicamente porque no tenemos un seguro social.
Yo soy vendedora ambulante por 38 años. 38 años.
Todos nosotros estamos haciendo un trabajo esencial, el cual nosotros seguimos trabajando durante pandemia. Muchos salimos a contagiarnos, de cual muchos de nuestros familiares perdieron la vida. Solamente estamos aquí exigiendo 3.5 billones a las autoridades de esta ciudad, a los gobernantes.
They are folks that care deeply about their community and have continued to make sacrifice after sacrifice in order to put food on the table, in order to make ends meet for their children especially.
Perdí mi trabajo, me enfermé de COVID, mi hermano se contagia y fallece y me quitan el apartamento. ¿Qué puedo decir? ¿Cómo me siento? Toda esa época pasé con algo que yo nunca lo experimenté, que el padre falleció hace 1 mes y medio. Y tengo hijos y yo sé que debo también pensar en ellos. Entonces, si llegara este dinero a mí me va a cambiar la vida.
No he recibido ni un centavo del país. Yo 38 años que trabajo y el país no me ha dado hasta ahora.
He pasado por calambres, me he sentido con bastante sueño, la presión me ha subido un poquito, la presión arterial, siento dolor en mis músculos. Claro, psicológicamente estoy siendo golpeada. Yo y mis compañeros, por la indiferencia de este gobierno, que no sean indolentes ante el dolor y ante el hambre.
They are New Yorkers who have had enough of being treated as if they're invisible or as if they're like unworthy members of our society.
Y es muy doloroso ver que en una ciudad llena de abundancia hayamos familias que estemos pasando por esta situación.
It's important to know and understand that the governor and his original budget proposal did not include any money for these excluded workers.
One of the biggest things I've learned so far is how manipulative Andrew Cuomo is. He'll create all these grand statements saying that he wants to empower people, and then all of a sudden he'll create all these loopholes so that these social programs that exist really aren't accessible to the people that they're designed for, and he'll do what he wants with his budget.
I think it's important for people in other states to also pay attention, because if we're able to pass this, this would be historic. And there aren't immigrants just in the state of New York. There's immigrants everywhere. We all have immigrant neighbors. So this is something that's very needed across the nation.
They know what they're fighting for and why they're fighting for it, and we're ready to keep fighting until the end.
So quite a courageous act to go on hunger strike over this, and good on all of the people who are participating and trying to make noise about this. You note that Andrew Cuomo is called out there by name, and he should be. We talked a little bit earlier about other issues with Andrew Cuomo, but this is another one. And to tie it into what I was talking about with Shervin earlier, there's this element of theater and all, talk but no walk. And Cuomo all too happy to engage in the theater to write a self-aggrandizing book and then leave people out to dry. Not only leave people out to dry, leave the most vulnerable, marginalized, oppressed communities out to dry, the very communities that he pretends to care about with his rhetoric, with his theater, and then turn around and screw over with his policy. So harrowing story there, very courageous act. I stand in solidarity with all workers who are striking, and with all of the members of New York who are participating in this hunger strike to try to achieve some level of justice, at least as it pertains to the COVID responses. What do you say? This is one of those areas too, you guys, where we're a nation of immigrants, and dependent upon the context, we're either proud of that or we smear them and engage in xenophobia, right? I say we, I mean like American culture, us as a society. There's the whole like Schrodinger's immigrant, right? Where we both want to portray immigrants as lazy and complain that they're taking our jobs. Well, which one is it? You can't fucking have both. Which one is it? To so mistreat a group of people when your entire, like when a lot of your cultural pride comes from that we're a nation of immigrants, and that we provide opportunity, the American dream, right? You can come here and live the American dream and succeed and innovate and whatever. It's such a massive hypocrisy and contradiction in terms, and it obviously has some hints and undertones of xenophobia sprinkled in there with it. So shame on Andrew Cuomo, shame on the state of New York for handling the pandemic as horrendously as they have in a whole myriad of ways. And I stand in solidarity with all of the people striking. I want to move on to a story here about Joe Manchin's corruption. We touched a little bit on this. I showed you guys a clip last week of Zed Jelani on Breaking Points talking about how Manchin's daughter is involved in big business, and she had actually been quite involved as an executive with a company in West Virginia that offshored all of its jobs pretty much the moment that her group took over, and then she was left with a $20-some million golden parachute as those jobs were offshored and West Virginians were left out to dry. This despite the fact that her father is a senator in West Virginia. And Manchin has been silent about all of this stuff. So I want to bring you guys an article here. This is in Vanity Fair. We can't reach him. Joe Manchin is ghosting the West Virginia union workers whose jobs his daughter helped outsource. She got a $30.8 million. I apologize. I understated it. $30.8 million golden parachute in a corporate merger. Now they're being laid off, and the medicines they produced are set to be manufactured overseas. Will anyone step up to save their jobs and protect America's drug supply? And I quickly want to note, you guys, while I view purchasing goods from other countries as not being inherently bad, because we're getting actual goods and services in return for some numbers on a spreadsheet effectively, right? while it's not bad to engage in that, we also, one thing that COVID taught us, or should have taught us, is that we do benefit from having some supply chains in our own country. We would benefit from producing goods in our own country when a crisis hits. And World War II is a really great example of this, you guys. FDR went to a number of companies and basically said, you're now going to be manufacturing war supplies, right? We had the capacity to do that, to ramp up the effort for World War II. Now, similarly, when COVID hit, we should have been able to go to manufacturers and say, you're now making ventilators, you're now making masks. You know what I mean? We should have waived the IP rights, or, you know, this is a more complicated issue because it's actually a worldwide issue, and Europe is holding up the TRIPS waiver. But the point in principle still stands. If you waive those IP rights and then allow other manufacturers to start producing the vaccines, you get a quicker rollout. We could have gone to construction companies and said, look, we're gonna invest public money in building COVID clinics or hospitals, and you're now going to take this contract and you're going to build this medical facility. Things like this could have very easily been done if we had the productive capacity to do so. So there's an argument to be made that while it's not inherently bad to bring in goods and services from around the world, there's a lot to be gained from having some capacity to produce when a crisis hits, whatever you may need to produce to try to fend off that crisis, right? We could have been much more effective at combating this pandemic if we had the ability to produce the goods that are needed to help protect us from this pandemic. Carrying on with this article, though, about the specifics of Manchin's role here and his daughter. On July 31st, one of America's largest pharmaceutical manufacturing plants is scheduled to shut its doors. Set on 22 acres in Morgantown, West Virginia, the plant, built in 1965 by the once storied American generic drug company Mylan Laboratories, has made 61 drug products, including a substantial portion of the world's supply of levothyroxine, apologies if I butchered that name, a critical thyroid medicine. Its 1,431 highly trained workers, analytical chemists, industrial engineers, and senior janitors among them, are represented by the Steelworkers Union. All are slated to be laid off by month's end. The Biden administration has a stated goal of increasing domestic production of pharmaceuticals, and the Morgantown plant is one of a dwindling number of facilities on home soil that produce vital and affordable medicine for the U.S. market. The plant has also lifted hundreds of West Virginia families into the middle class, with the children of its employees going on to become doctors and lawyers. Under Mylan's co-founder Mike Puskar, apologies if I'm butchering that name as well, employees receive free healthcare and medicine, turkeys on Thanksgiving, Christmas bonuses, and generous wages. Quote, my father walked the plant once a week, Puskar's daughter, Johanna, told Vanity Fair. We knew everyone's names. We knew their children's names. We knew their parents' names. Puskar died in 2011, 9 years after he placed a businessman named Robert J. Coury at the company's helm. So it appears that this used to be a sort of a standout example of a business that actually cared about its community and its workers. That's an extraordinary rarity. I just want to be really clear. But as soon as these sort of corporate heads came in and took over, which included Joe Manchin's daughter, the attitude towards the community and towards the workers completely changed. And they became, numbers on a balance sheet as opposed to human beings. The costs became calculated in financial terms instead of in human terms, and these kinds of things. So what's incredible about this is that Manchin has not faced any criticism or scrutiny about this. For somebody who has taken quite a bit of pride in becoming one of the most powerful members of the Senate just by political happenstance, that he happens to kind of be the furthest right of the Democrats, means that he ends up being a gatekeeper when the Senate is as close as it is. 50-50 is as close as it can be, right? So it empowers Manchin, this kind of political environment. That he has not faced scrutiny for this happening in his state and for his daughter's role in it is absolutely incredible. It's quite an indictment on the media. It's quite an indictment on the Senate as an institution and on the Democratic Party. And just a little funny side note. Manchin apparently, even though his daughter was high up at this company, he didn't even know what they were producing. He apparently asked one of the workers, or mentioned to one of the workers, some drug that they hadn't produced in years, and said, "Oh yeah, you guys are making that there," or whatever. And the worker was like, "No, we actually haven't made that in years." So Manchin, just entirely out of touch about what is actually happening at this facility, allows the offshoring of those jobs while he is supposed to be championing West Virginians in his work, and faces zero scrutiny about it whatsoever. And he's been entirely silent about the offshoring of those jobs. Despite the fact that the president of his party, Joe Biden, has made it a stated goal to ramp up pharmaceutical production in this country. And again, like as critical as I am of Joe Biden on almost everything, I agree with that. We need to increase our productive capacity of medical goods. The pandemic should have taught us that, among a whole plethora of other lessons. But this story, quite something, and I'll continue to keep up with this story and bring you guys updates as they present themselves. Joe Manchin, worthy of plenty of criticism. And this kind of, there's also very much a, I can't claim this as fact. To me, there's very much nepotism involved here. I'd use the example, would Don Trump Jr. have the public profile he has without his dad being Donald Trump? Would Hunter Biden be making millions of dollars for his paintings, or would Hunter Biden have gotten a job on the board of a Ukraine energy company if his dad was not at the time vice president who was in charge of Ukraine policy, and if his dad was not currently president of the United States? I don't think so. Would Joe Manchin's daughter have gotten this kind of a job that left her with a $30 million golden parachute if her dad wasn't in the Senate and wasn't one of the more powerful members of the Senate? I don't think so. Call me nuts. I don't think so. I see nepotism at play here, which has become its own version of corruption via the proximity to power that I was talking about earlier. And actually, very quick side note, I kind of wish I would have queued this story up, actually, but there was a piece about Pete Buttigieg. I always butcher his name, you guys. I'm so sorry. I just call him Mayor Pete. So Mayor Pete and his husband, oh, Jesus, I'm blanking on his name, Chasin or something. Anyway, apparently, his husband has grown tired of the fact that everybody wants to talk to him only because of his proximity to a secretary of the Biden administration, right? So like there was in this story, which was actually about, it revealed the elitism of DC, because it was about like they were complaining that they couldn't find an apartment that met all of their elite needs for anything less than like $5,000 a month or something. So they settled for an apartment that was only $3,000 and something a month, right? Rich people problems through and through. By the way, they've both sold best-selling books. They're not like hurting for cash. Pete makes over $200,000 a year as a secretary of transportation. So like give me a break with the whole wham, we can't afford what we need. Bullshit. You can't afford, some additional luxury that you want. Bullshit. But the reason I bring this up is his husband was apparently growing very tired of the environment in DC where everybody wants to talk to him, but not for the sake of getting to know him or appreciating him as a human being or wanting to be friends with him or any of these kinds of things. People wanted to talk to him just to get to Pete. And there was one guy who basically said, he was a lobbyist, and he basically said to Pete's husband, well, my boss would kill me if I didn't at least ask you to pass along blah-de-blah to the secretary. I mean, how revolting and nauseating is that? Doesn't that just make your stomach lurch? That's such a common practice in DC is indicative of the problem, and that's why I bring up the nepotism and the proximity to power stuff as it pertains to Manchin and his daughter. If you are a family member or close associate of one of these very powerful people, you end up in your own way kind of participating in the revolving door. Even if it's just as a vehicle to get to the powerful person, right? So Joe Manchin and his corruption and barbarity and inhumanity and ignorance shining through on this issue of offshoring jobs from Milan. Wanted to talk a little bit about, the political environment, and again, I really don't talk about Trump very much, you guys, but I think that this is worthy of note. This is in Politico. Trump-backed candidate loses in Texas special election. State Representative Jake Elzy will head to Congress after defeating Trump-endorsed Susan Wright in a runoff featuring 2 GOP candidates. So this was I want to be clear, this was not the primary, this was the general election, and we'll talk in a minute about why that actually might be relevant to the outcome. Voters in North Texas delivered an upset Tuesday, picking GOP State Representative Jake Elzy to fill a vacant House seat over a candidate endorsed by former President Donald Trump. Elzy beat fellow Republican Susan Wright, the widow of former Representative Ron Wright, 53% to 47% when the Associated Press called the low turnout Republican versus Republican runoff. Though Elzy was better funded, Wright leaned heavily on her backing from the former president, who often plays kingmaker in Republican primaries. So the reason it's relevant that this wasn't a primary, that this was actually the general, is that Democrats and independents were voting as well. And Trump may have had a backlash effect on them. So the fact that he endorsed Wright and that Wright was clinging to Donald Trump and using that as her main campaign tool may well have turned off some of the Democrats and independents. So that is a factor. But the reason I'm bringing this up, you guys, is it's always worth kind of paying attention to the political happenings of the two major parties and who has influence and who doesn't, and what dynamics are going to play into what races. And Donald Trump had previously kind of had, the power to come into a primary and alter it. It is worth noting that he tended to only involve himself in primaries where it looked like his candidate was going to win anyway. So he might have been taking the easy way out to not look bad in some of these races. But if his power is dwindling, that will affect how Republican candidates run. If they don't have to kiss up to Trump so much to try to win over his endorsement, if they view his endorsement as not being as consequential going forward, that will alter how people run their races and who ends up winning those races. So it's worth noting that as Trump has disappeared from the public spotlight, or not quite disappeared, but is less in the public spotlight over the past half year or so, it appears that his leverage over the Republican Party is also beginning to dwindle, and that could have reverberating effects on electoral politics going forward. So I thought this was worth noting and interesting that his endorsement here did not sway the race in North Texas there. We'll see what Trump wants to do about 2024. That is relevant because for us progressives, if we want to primary either Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, the argument that was used most against Bernie and that landed most, and I can tell you this both from looking at polling and statistics and from my anecdotal experience on the ground. I volunteered in 4 different states for Bernie Sanders' campaign, and I can tell you, I heard quite routinely at the door that hey, I really like Bernie's policy and I really like Bernie and he seems like a great candidate, but I'm concerned he can't beat Trump. That's the media's that's the propaganda working. The how electable are you argument working on voters. And if Trump runs again, that same argument is bolstered. It's a stronger argument. And I'm not saying logically or objectively. I'm saying within our current political environment and with the way that voters engage in politics. The argument will be stronger if Donald Trump is on the opposing ticket that, hey, you can't elect a progressive because they might not win. It's absurd on the surface. I just want to be really clear. I think Bernie would have beat Trump by more than Joe Biden beat Trump. That's my view, and I feel I can back that up. But a lot of voters don't look at it that way because they've been so effectively propagandized by the mainstream media. So if Trump runs, it will create that dynamic again, and it will bolster that establishment argument against whatever progressive candidates we have in the field once again. So I'm keeping an eye on what kind of influence Trump has over politics and how these elections end up going, because I think it's very relevant for progressives, both at the congressional level, the local level, and running for trying to primary Kamala Harris or Joe Biden, whoever ends up running. In that case. So I want to talk about a story I haven't yet touched on, but I have been following and I'm fascinated by. Stephen Donzinger is an attorney who successfully beat Chevron in court, and Chevron responded vindictively with the backing of the legal system. So I want to show you guys a quick clip here. This is from Breaking Points. They I thought did a really great job of going over some of the core details here. This is kind of a story that's trickled out over time. And we've gotten new little bits and pieces of information over time. But Stephen Donzinger was just actually sentenced to 6 months in jail for contempt of court in relation to this case against Chevron. It's absurd. He's already been on house arrest for a couple of years, you guys. He's been stuck in an apartment in New York for a couple of years. This story is another example of corruption and how these things operate, how Chevron gets undue leverage in our legal process, in our legal system, compared to everybody else. So I want to show you guys this clip kind of explaining some of the backstory and what's actually occurred here, and then we'll come back and discuss.
We have another unconscionable situation.
Speaking of corporate malfeasance.
Yeah, bring you an update on. Probably a lot of you have been following the case of Stephen Donzinger. For those of you who haven't, he was the human rights lawyer who won a huge award for indigenous people down in Ecuador against Chevron. Multi-billion-dollar settlement, quite historic because Chevron polluted the Amazon rainforest there, destroyed the lives, literally, of indigenous people in this community. Massive incidents of cancer and all their land completely ruined, all of that. So in a very, very, very rare win for indigenous people, Stephen Donzinger is part of this case, able to win the settlement against Chevron. And ever since then, they have made it their mission to destroy him. They actually had a campaign against him that internally was revealed as the demonized Donzinger campaign to sort of paint him as like some corrupt, horrible person, et cetera, et cetera. And unfortunately, the U.S. legal system has basically gone along with all of this. So the latest situation is he was being charged with contempt for some minor discovery dispute between him and Chevron, the type of thing that happens between corporations and lawyers all the time, this minor discovery dispute. The maximum penalty that has ever, the maximum sentence that has ever been issued for this type of offense is, I think, 2 months in prison. That's it. Okay, so this is a minor offense. In the most extreme case, we're talking about 2 months in prison. Well, he has been now incarcerated in his home, so on home arrest, for 720 days. The verdict just came back in this supposed case, which I'll tell you in a minute why it's complete, Chevron show trial. He's found guilty, sentenced to 6 months in prison, again, for contempt, okay? Which even if, and, I think it's pretty flimsy what Chevron and the court is arguing here, but even if they're correct, again, this sentence is wildly beyond what has ever been found for anyone in a similar circumstance. And oh, by the way, the other piece of this is that he was denied a jury. The government prosecutor, who should have been, the one handling the case and going after Donzinger, they looked at the details and were like, we're not doing this. We're not doing this whatsoever. So you would think that would be the end of the case, but no. They got another private prosecutor who happens to have all these ties to Chevron to go forward with the case. Oh, and then the judge who issued this ruling and the sentence also happens to be a leader in the Federalist Society, which is funded by Chevron. So Chevron has their hands in the judicial system at every level with regards to this case. Donzinger is going to appeal, but this isn't a completely just blatant, outrageous miscarriage of justice. He's effectively a sort of like corporate political prisoner now for more than 720 days. It boggles the mind that this goes on. And the last thing I'll say is the Biden administration could do something about this, but so far they haven't.
Nobody's done anything about this. And I just want people to realize that the contempt of court charge is, one of them is refusing to obey a court order to turn over his laptop and cell phone as evidence. He says that doing so would violate his legal client's privacy. And remember, all of this stems from the fact that he secured a $9.5 billion judgment against Chevron in Ecuador, which is still the largest human rights and environmental court judgment in history. Now, then a U.S. court ruled that the judgment was unenforceable because it was obtained, according to them, by fraud and racketeering. And then all of that stemmed from an investigation into Donzinger, who has now lived 2 years under house arrest. So, look, I think anybody can take a look at this and say that what's happened here is pretty ridiculous. The government wasn't even going to prosecute him. Private prosecutors were involved. He's been locked in his house for 2 years, which is completely nuts for a contempt of court case, and still might have to serve 6 months in jail.
Absolutely ridiculous, you guys. Beyond ridiculous. And the fact that they brought in a separate attorney who had connections to Chevron in order to ensure that Stephen was punished for daring to bring a lawsuit against Chevron. This is a story of how power operates. This is a story of how our legal system is not, to tie into, I did a segment with Irami Frimpong a while back where he talked about formalism and critical legal theory basically debunks formalism within our legal process. So the idea of formalism is that the law applies equally no matter who it's being applied to, and social, political, economic factors do not play in. We all know that's absurd. That's not how it operates. It's not operating in reality. And this is an example of that in the negative, right? This is how those outside factors influence our legal system in a detrimental way for everyday people and in a beneficial way for the rich and powerful. So, Stephen Donzinger is kind of a hero to win such a case against such a rapacious, harmful company as Chevron, who has been a major contributor to the climate crisis and who, obviously just behaves horrendously in all sorts of ways, how they treat their workers, all these kinds of things. So that the legal system does not actually treat Stephen as any other attorney and instead allows Chevron to have this disproportionate influence over the outcome and allows Chevron to basically behave vindictively towards an attorney who succeeded in suing them is, it's quite the indictment on our legal system. And if you really think that we actually apply the laws equally, you are out to lunch. And I have some bridges that I would like to sell you. I absolutely stand in solidarity with Stephen Donzinger and with other attorneys who work to try to bring some accountability to these gigantic companies who pollute our planet, mistreat their workers, overcharge their customers, and get away with that kind of greedy, rapacious behavior and corruption. Unbelievable. 2 years on house arrest, you guys, for a contempt charge. I mean, that is just so beyond the pale. That is so beyond the pale. In most states, the maximum, I shouldn't say that. In my state, I don't know about most states. In my state of Washington, the maximum sentence for a misdemeanor is 364 days and fines. So he's served twice the maximum for a misdemeanor for a contempt charge. And they just sentenced him to 6 more months in jail. It's so beyond the pale. I struggle to even express how absurd and ridiculous that is and how badly we need to change these systems and institutions who allow that result to happen. Shame on Chevron, shame on the judge, shame on anybody involved who decided to do the bidding of Chevron instead of uphold any form of justice in this particular case. And we will continue to keep up on that story as well. I'm hopeful that Stephen can be successful in fighting this verdict in some way, shape, or form. I'm sure it will be appealed, though I don't know where we're at in that process or how likely that is to succeed. But I stand with Stephen Donzinger and I stand with attorneys everywhere who put in tireless work to try to bring some level of accountability to these companies. So I want to talk about the infrastructure negotiations. This is quite a complicated issue in a sense, and very simple in other ways, right? The needs are quite simple. We need like $10 trillion just to come back up to par, and the negotiations are significantly below that. The package that Bernie Sanders has proposed as the chair of the Senate Budget Committee would address some of those needs. It's not adequate in my view, but it does do a lot of good things, and I hope that it's successful. It's about $3.5 trillion, It includes some, you know, it addresses some of the environmental issues that are not at all addressed in the bipartisan bill. And it provides some things like universal pre-K and some other like good things that would tangibly improve people's lives. Okay. But it's looking more and more like that's not likely to happen because of Kyrsten Sinema, who we talked about earlier, who has basically come out and said, I will not support that reconciliation bill. Fuck everybody who needs it. I care more about the theatrical nonsense that I work with Republicans. I'm going to do my curtsy and thumbs down the environmental needs of constituents and the financial needs of constituents and the derated infrastructure that the civil engineers have given the United States. Shame on Kyrsten Sinema, shame on Joe Manchin, shame on all these fucking assholes standing in the way of even the most minor form of progress on this issue. So I want to show you guys a clip here of Bernie Sanders actually kind of saying that he that he is going to do what he can to ensure that the reconciliation bill has support before he supports the bipartisan bill. And because the Senate's so close, you guys, it's entirely possible that one senator can tank this. So in the same way that Sinema can tank the reconciliation bill as one senator, Bernie can do the same fucking thing to the bipartisan bill. And he can basically say, look, if you don't get on board with the reconciliation bill, I'm not voting for your bipartisan bullshit. And he kind of implies here in an interview with Crystal Ball that he may be willing to do that. So this is a couple minutes of Bernie talking about the infrastructure package and sort of making a tepid threat. So I'm glad to see this. I hope he follows through on it. We'll take a listen to what he has to say.
You and me, don't tell anybody. I think this whole process doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Look, you got needs out there. Mm-hmm. Should we invest heavily in rebuilding our crumbling infrastructure, roads, bridges, water, huge problem, wastewater plants, broadband? All of those are huge issues. Of course we should do it. My own preference would have been to do it in one bill. That's all. And get the 50 votes plus the vice president that we need. Again, there are 50 members of the Democratic caucus. Some felt it very important to, for whatever reason, to show the world that they can work with Republicans, and that's what this process is about. So I think by and large, and we haven't seen the fine print of this legislation yet as you and I chat, I think the investments are sensible. Roads, bridges, all that stuff. Creates jobs, it's important. What we call the pay-fors, how these things are going to be funded in many ways do not make a lot of sense to me based on what I have seen up to now. They are pretty conservative approaches. And the reason for that is Republicans, of course, don't want to raise any taxes on the wealthy or large corporations. So the Democratic negotiators are caught in a bind.
What's your understanding right now of those pay-fors?
I think the
asset recycling.
Yeah, that is the idea that we privatize infrastructure, that we give over roads and bridges and parking meters or whatever it may be to the private sector, I think is a very foolish idea. I'm not a great fan of privatization. And what they are also doing is taking money from other pots of money that were passed in previous COVID bills, which should be used later on. Concern about small businesses, restaurants, etc. So in general, the pay-fors are not good. But here is the bottom line, and this is the world that we live in. We have 50 votes. One person says no, nothing happens. So I am willing to go along, I think, I want to see the final details, of the bipartisan bill if there is 100% agreement on the part of the Democrats who are negotiating this, that they are going to go along with the reconciliation package.
And do you have those assurances today?
That is a very good question. And the fate of all I can tell you is, if I have anything to say about it, there will not be a bipartisan bill unless there is a reconciliation bill.
So all things considered, that's a pretty strong thing for Bernie to come out and say. Again, it's that's relative to our current political environment. I wish he was even stronger on that. I wish he unequivocally said, I will not support the bipartisan bill unless there are set in stone assurances that the reconciliation bill is also going to pass. But that is a threat. Okay, I want everybody to understand that. That is Bernie saying, I'm willing to go to the mat on this one. And I think that's a very good thing. The climate crisis is as existential an issue as we currently face, and it needs to be addressed in order for all other issues to really matter, quite frankly. So I want to also show you guys a clip here. This is David Dayen. He's kind of explaining. So they talked about how one of the quote unquote pay fors, and just to be really, really clear, I know most of my audience understands this. We can increase the deficit. We don't need to quote unquote pay for any of this. And Bernie understands this. Stephanie Kelton was his chief economist for quite some time. So he's saying his concern with the bipartisan bill is that the rest of the Senate is insisting on quote unquote paying for this in ways that are conservative as opposed to progressive. Instead of increasing the deficit and creating jobs and getting done the human needs that need to get done, we're sitting here and arguing about how you're going to pay for it. But specifically to the idea of privatizing infrastructure as a way of paying for this stuff, you guys, think about what that means. Do you want all of your roads to turn into toll roads? All of your bridges, toll bridges? Do you want to have to pay to go through the tunnels? This is an absurd proposal on behalf of the establishment of both parties in the Senate, and that there seems to be somewhat unanimous consent around this pay for is, to me, quite absurd. So this is David Dayen kind of explaining some of those details. And how that process would actually work and why it is so harmful.
Talk to us first about just where we are with the bipartisan infrastructure package. Seemed like it was close and ready to go, and now it sort of seems like the wheels have fallen off.
Yeah. We get conflicting reports. You hear that they're 90% there or 95% there. And then you also hear things like, it's completely done except for the part about mass transit, highways, bridges, broadband, and wages. So except for everything, they've got it covered. So I don't know exactly where we're going to be. I know there's sort of a soft deadline in the next 24 to 48 hours. One of the problems is that Democrats need to know whether this bill is going to go before they run their budget resolution, which will be the prelude to the reconciliation bill, because that bill has a number attached to it. The idea is if the bipartisan bill happens, then the reconciliation bill will be at $3.5 trillion. But if it doesn't happen, they will fold all of that spending into the reconciliation bill. And you simply need to know ahead of time what the upper limit for spending is on that reconciliation bill in order to pass the budget resolution that sets the stage. So that's why Schumer, I think, has been speeding up this, or trying to speed up this process. And that's going to come to a head pretty soon.
One of the things that you've been pointing to and we wanted to cover is specifically how private equity is eyeing some of the benefits within this bill. Can you go through what we have? We have one of them specifically. It's the second tear sheet that we built here. Go ahead and put that up there on the screen. Eyeing federal infrastructure windfall, private equity courts public utilities. Tell us about that, David.
Yeah, this was a great piece by our new writing fellow, Lee Harris, who talked to this company called Bernhard Capital, that has for a little while now tried to approach mid-sized cities, usually poor cities in the Southeast that have crumbling infrastructure systems, and offer them a deal. Say, we'll front you a bunch of money. All you have to do is give us a long-term lease on your public power or water system and let us run it for 30 years, 75 years, and keep all the profits. So this is a considered strategy on the part of Bernhard Capital and perhaps other private equity firms. And the particulars, particularly of the bipartisan infrastructure bill, might facilitate that, because one of the so-called pay-fors in that bill is public-private partnerships and something called asset recycling. Public-private partnerships just means exactly what I said, the leasing out the management and operations of a public asset, an infrastructure asset like a utility or a water system or something like that, there will be incentives, I guess, in the bill for that. And the other asset recycling is essentially selling off older infrastructure to pay for newer infrastructure. And I guess the way this would work in the federal bill is that there would be an incentive for a city to sell off their water system the way that Bernhard Capital wants. And the federal government would give a small incentive, cash incentive, to the city in order to do that. So instead of the government having to pay for a new highway in that city, they would just give 10%, as a boost to the money that the city is going to generate by selling off their own infrastructure. And what you get in that process is the potential for higher rates in terms of whether it's rate paying in utilities or toll roads or things like that. You lose democratic control over that asset. Often maintenance sags, labor sags, because now it's a for-profit business, and any cuts to the spending side show up in the profit side. So it's really, really dangerous, and it's easily the most dangerous part of this bipartisan package.
So a great explanation there from David Dayen, but is this what we want, you guys? To increase, tolls and costs and privatize all of these public goods, your water, your transportation? You want that privatized? This is insane. This is utterly insane. It's dystopian. And I also want to note, he went on later in that interview to say that it's actually exactly the infrastructure package that was proposed by the Trump administration. Donald Trump wanted the public-private partnerships to be the core of the infrastructure bill. The person who Trump put in charge of infrastructure is praising this bipartisan effort led by the Biden administration and by Democratic majorities in both houses of Congress. That should tell you all that you need to know. You elect Democrats, what do you get? Republican fucking policy. Just utterly ridiculous. I also wanted to show you guys a portion, I think, from an article here. This was tweeted out again by More Perfect Union. Once again, if you guys don't follow their work, please do. But this is about Kristen Sinema. They say, sounds like Senator Sinema doesn't want her vacation filibustered. Funny little quip there, play on her position on the filibuster reform. But I'll bring this up full screen here. Can't stop, won't stop Sinema's summer. Sinema is not letting BIF or the reconciliation bill get in the way of her summer plans. When Chuck Schumer announced earlier this month that he might keep the Senate in session into August, delaying a previously scheduled recess in order to shepherd the two gigantic bills through the chamber, Sinema told the majority leader that she was not sticking around to vote, multiple Senate sources tell Playbook. She had prior vacation plans, she said, and wasn't about to let the infrastructure or reconciliation bills get in the way. Boy, I mean, where do you even start with that one, you guys? No, I'm not going to do my job and serve my constituents and the American people. I want to go on vacation. Fuck you. Pound sand. I know we desperately need this bill. Fuck you, pound sand. I know that we're burning the planet. I know we need to address the climate crisis, but no, I want to go on vacation. I know people need jobs. I know our infrastructure is horrendous, but no, I want to go on vacation. How elitist, how snobby, how selfish. Where do you even go with that? And also, even if you take all of the like morality out of the discussion, how politically incompetent is that? Who gives that kind of quote? No, I'm not going to serve you. I want to go on vacation. Will you please reelect me? Oh my God. Just absolutely stunning, the stupidity and the political ineptness displayed there by Kyrsten Sinema, and the immorality and the unwillingness to do her job displayed there by Kyrsten Sinema. She doesn't think that workers should receive $15 an hour, but she has no problem taking a couple $100,000 a year and then telling you she wants to go on vacation instead of doing her job. Shame on you, Senator Sinema. You ought to be primaried. Shame on you. Unbelievable. Just unbelievable. I have particular contempt for Senator Sinema and the way that she very clearly portrays her disdain for the American public and her selfish, rapacious incentives. It is utterly disgusting and repulsive. Shame on Senator Sinema. I wanted to talk a little bit about Nina Turner's campaign here. She is running against Shontel Brown in Ohio's 11th, I believe. This is a special election. Marcia Fudge was appointed to the Biden administration, opening this seat up. So it's a special election that the primary is actually happening in just a few days here, and or maybe even sooner, a day or two. Anyhow, Shontel Brown has run an incredibly dirty campaign. She has lied about Nina Turner, lied about Nina Turner's positions. She has taken Republican money and corporate money while she accuses Nina Turner of not being a loyal enough Democrat. Just an unbelievably dirty campaign. She's backed by the establishment. She's taking money from Robert Kraft, who's a close Trump associate, owner of the Patriots, and other Republicans as well, other corporations and corporate interests as well. And then she's accusing Nina Turner of essentially being, opposed to the Democratic Party or whatever. It's you're taking money from the Democratic Party's opponent while you say that, you fucking hypocrite. Just unbelievable stuff here. This is in Common Dreams. Nina Turner primary opponent Shontel Brown facing felony ethics probe. Quote, "This is certainly a shocking revelation and it raises very serious ethical and legal questions," says Cara Turrentine, Turner's deputy campaign manager. Or maybe Kara. I'm so bad with names, you guys. I butcher names left and right. Apologies up front. Progressives on Tuesday reacted with a total lack of surprise to a report that Shontel Brown, the Cuyahoga, another probably butchered pronunciation, County, Ohio council member running against former Ohio State Senator Nina Turner in next week's special primary election for Ohio's 11th congressional district seat, has been referred to state ethics officials following accusations of felony corruption. Newsweek reports the Office of the Ohio Auditor reviewed allegations published in April by The Intercept that Brown, who is also the county Democratic Party chair, had voted to award millions worth of contracts to companies connected to her romantic partner and campaign donors. So as it turns out, she ended up directing funds to a company founded by her partner's, I want to say, uncle, that he is involved with. So brazen corruption here, in addition to all of the corporate cash that she takes, in addition to taking money from Republicans, in addition to lying about and smearing Nina Turner, she has also engaged in this type of brazen quid pro quo corruption, brazen nepotism. It's beyond the pale, as many things in politics are. And unfortunately, though Nina Turner had a very strong lead early on in this election, her poll numbers have dwindled, and Shontel Brown has somewhat caught up to her, and it looks like a very close race. So here is to hoping that Nina can win. She was campaigning with Cornel West was there. Bernie went to campaign with her. AOC went to campaign with her. Some of the progressives have tried to do what they can to bolster her campaign. But Shontel Brown clearly has the backing of the establishment and the elites and the wealthy and the big money donors and all these kinds of things. Also, undoubtedly, the backing of the mainstream media. Nina Turner very disliked because she was Bernie Sanders' campaign co-chair, and when I mean disliked by the establishment, by the mainstream press, they very much hold that against her and continue to behave in retaliatory ways, if that's a word. They retaliation against anybody who's closely associated to Bernie Sanders or pushing for progressive policy. So we'll see what happens this week in that district. It's a very blue district, you guys. So whoever wins this primary is gonna go to Congress, and that's why it is such a critical primary. There's not even like when Bernie ran for president. It was okay. You get through the primary, then you got to beat Donald Trump. No, this is a double-digit blue district. So whoever wins this primary is going to Congress, and Shontel Brown would clearly just be another establishment type. Another, puppet for the powerful and even for Republicans like Robert Kraft. So shame on Shontel for her lies, for her smears, for her corruption, for her ethics violations. Pretty outrageous and egregious candidate in Shontel Brown, and that needs to be called out. And one more kind of fun story here, you guys. This has been kind of information that's trickled out from behind the scenes reporting about the White House and Democrats' view of Kamala Harris. This is in the Hill. Harris's bad polls triggered Democratic worries. Vice President Harris has some ground to make up in order to be perceived more favorably by the public, a complicating factor for the Biden administration as it maps out its midterm strategy. 6 months into office, polls indicate Harris is viewed less favorably than President Biden. She has also made some tactical missteps outside of the White House that Democrats say show she hasn't quite yet found her bearings. Vice presidents historically do not outperform the leader at the top of the ticket, but her lower ratings haven't gone unnoticed. In a trio of recent surveys, Harris earned a combined unfavorable rating of 46%, according to an aggregate average compiled by Real Clear Politics. That number is 3 points lower than Biden's 43 in the same category. Kamala Harris is really a objectively terrible politician. Whatever you think of her and her policy views, I happen to think they're pretty conservative and horrendous. And really, she's more like a hollow husk that just does whatever's politically expedient than a principled politician. But that aside, whatever you think of her and her views, she's an objectively bad politician. She had every built-in advantage in the book going into the primary season this year. The mainstream press deemed her a favorite and did everything they could to prop her up. Same with Beto O'Rourke. Both had to drop before Iowa. For the Biden administration, for Joe Biden and his team to think this was an intelligent pick for vice president from a political perspective is laughable. Kamala Harris is just an objectively bad politician. The more she talks, the more she's disliked. She's very smug. She's very arrogant. She's very condescending. She comes off as a member of the elite. And that is kind of largely despised by voters, right? She's not a relatable person. She does not respond well to pushback or being challenged. She does her condescending laugh or her condescending smirk in response to any pushback. Sometimes not even answering questions in a coherent manner, like when she was asked about not going to the border. She for months had not even visited the border when she's apparently in charge of that particular policy. And when she was asked about this, she just kind of smugly laughed and she said, well, I haven't been to Europe either. Like, I don't understand why it matters. She's not somebody that is very likable. And so if the Democrats' plan here was that by making her vice president, she would effectively have the nomination for president locked up in 2024, they have fucked up royally. Joe Biden, for from a progressive perspective, all of the faults in his policy, he has a much more likable, just by the polls. Like I can rip him to shreds about being racist and his assault of Tara Reid and his sexual harassment of women and his supporting the bankruptcy bill and all these kinds of, do I have that backwards? He doesn't want people to be able to file bankruptcy for medical debt or for college debt. This was a whole battle in the 2000s. All of these faults, right? Iraq war, crime bill, chastising Anita Hill, leading he actually led the berating of Anita Hill because he was the chair of the committee that did the questioning of Anita Hill in the 90s. On and on and on. I can go through and just shred Joe Biden's character, but his perceived, his perception among the American public is significantly better than that of Kamala Harris. So from a progressive perspective, if we would like to run a progressive candidate and have any success in the 2024 primary, I think we're better off running against Harris than we are Biden. Kamala Harris has proven herself to be entirely incompetent, kind of a bumbling moron when it comes to trying to run a campaign and appeal to voters. She's not relatable. She comes off smug and condescending. It seems that some in the White House are finally starting to recognize this reality and starting to grow concerned about her poll numbers and things like that. So funny for me to see, kind of entertaining, kind of ha, we told you so kind of a thing. But I believe the New York Times going into the primary season last year picked her and Beto as their favorites to win the nomination. That tells you how out of touch the New York Times editorial board is as well. So the press will do everything to fluff her up. The Democratic Party clearly thinks that by making her vice president, they have selected the next president whenever Biden should step aside, whether that is, whether that is in the middle of this term, whether that is at the end of his first term, or whether he runs again. I think they were hoping that Kamala would be, the next president whenever Biden steps aside or decides not to run or finishes his second term. And clearly a gross miscalculation. They clearly thought that putting her in that spot would achieve some level of popularity that they're not going to achieve. They clearly thought that playing identity politics to the exclusion of any economic populism or substantive policy reform was going to be an effective strategy, and it clearly is not. So that kind of validates some of what progressives say on these issues, and we'll see how this affects things going forward in future primaries and in her career going forward. So want to really urge you guys once again to go to realprogressives.org if you want to learn more about us or contribute to our organization. You can find our Patreon there on our website, at Real Progress US, at RP_in_action, and at Luke Parcher Show. If you want to follow us on Twitter, please do subscribe to both of our YouTube shows. Please smash that like button and comment. Help us combat that YouTube algorithm. And I want to leave you guys here with a clip, another clip of the new Untouchables. This is a little teaser. Please go check out that episode tonight, dropping at 8 Eastern on the Real Progress in Action YouTube page. Here's one more trailer that we'll watch here before closing the show out.
The sad part of all this is that John and I are where the rubber meets the road. They're where people come into our offices who were having heart attacks and strokes and losing their homes and committing suicide. And it's still going on. We're seeing this perpetuation of communities who don't have the asset bases that they had accumulated or were trying to, because whenever the foreclosure proceedings and everything started happening, a lot of the people that we represent never showed up in court because they couldn't afford attorneys.
Please make sure to catch that episode, you guys. I will be there. Make sure that you join me, and please check out all of our other content. We do all sorts of fantastic stuff. Our founder, Steve Grumbine, is putting up videos a lot. He hosts the Macro and Cheese podcast, which drops every Saturday morning, talking about economic and political issues from an MMT perspective. We also have MMT Mondays with our resident historian, Caleb Mood. Those drop Monday nights. Make sure to catch that tomorrow. And don't miss the Up with Jody Newell. All sorts of fantastic content. Please make sure you're not missing out. We have articles at realprogressives.org addressing the most, relevant issues of the day. Make sure you're not missing out on any of our content. Thank you all for tuning in this week, and I will see you all next Sunday.